The 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, the spearhead of the Great Crusade under the direct command of War Master Horus Lupercal, moved through the void with the grace of an apex predator entering new hunting grounds. Following the compliance of 6319, a campaign that had tested the ideological resolve of the 16th Legion, the fleet pushed outward into the unmapped darkness of the galactic fringe. This region of space was silent to the psychic screams of the warp, a calm expanse that unnerved the navigators and astropaths who were accustomed to the roiling tides of the Imperium. It was here, in the deep black, that the sensors of the Vengeful Spirit and its escort vessels began to register anomalies that defied the standard categorization of xenostatic or feral human incoherence. The initial detection was not a distress call, nor was it the aggressive targeting lock of a defense grid. It was music, complex, mathematically perfect, and broadcasting on frequencies that suggested a level of technological sophistication comparable to, or perhaps even exceeding, the standard cogitator encryption of the Mechanicum. The signals were not emanating from a single point, but formed a web of communication stretching across multiple star systems. For the logistical masters of the Great Crusade, this was the telltale sign of a stellar empire, a cohesive civilization that had maintained interstellar travel during the isolation of Old Night. To the bridge crews of the 63rd, this was a discovery of monumental proportions, a pocket of humanity that had not devolved into barbarism, standing intact and proud against the horrors of the galaxy. The source of the immediate signals, however, drew the fleet toward a specific system, a place that would soon earn a designation written in the blood of Astartes, the planet Eurosarach, known to the Imperium only as Murder. The 63rd expedition was not the first Imperial force to stumble upon this cursed world. That dubious honor belonged to the 140th Expeditionary Fleet, primarily comprised of the Blood Angels, the 9th Legion. They had picked up faint, desperate signals, not the harmonious music of the Interex, but the dying cries of their own kin. Upon arrival in the system, the scope of the disaster became apparent. The planet Eurosarach was a death world of the highest order, shrouded in a turbulent atmosphere that wreaked havoc on void shields and communication arrays. The surface was a nightmare landscape of red dust and towering stone spires that resembled petrified trees, creating a claustrophobic labyrinth of rock. It was in this environment that Captain Kita's Frome of the Blood Angels and his company had made planetfall, expecting a standard compliance action against a feral population. Instead, they found the megarachnids. The analysis of the battlefield remains found by the subsequent waves of Imperial forces painted a grim picture of biological efficiency. The megarachnids were large, chitinous xenos forms, possessing a terrifying speed and limbs that ended in monomolecular blades capable of shearing through ceramite power armor as if it were parchment. They were not merely beasts, they were a swarm intelligence, utilizing the stone spires of their world to launch ambushes from above, negating the tactical advantages of the Astartes. The 140th expedition had been butchered. Hundreds of space marines, the Emperor's finest creations, lay dismembered among the red dust, their gene seed unrecoverable in the carnage. The 63rd expedition arrived to find the remnants of a second rescue attempt already underway. The Emperor's children, the 3rd Legion, had deployed forces under Lord Commander Eidolon and Captain Saul Tarvitz to secure the bodies of the Blood Angels. The fighting on the surface was desperate. The atmospheric interference rendered orbital bombardment imprecise and dangerous, forcing the Astartes to engage the megarachnids in close-quarters combat, a domain where the xenos excelled. The arrival of Horus and the Luna Wolves turned the tide, bringing the overwhelming firepower of the War Master's own legion to bear against the arachnid hordes. Yet, even as the heavy bolters of the Justaran Terminators churned the xenos into paste, the nature of the conflict shifted abruptly with the arrival of a new player in the system. Sensors on the Vengeful Spirit detected a fleet translating from the void, but these were not Imperial reinforcements. The ships were sleek, lacking the Gothic, cathedral-like bulk of Imperial battleships or the jagged, scavenged aesthetic of Orc hulks. They were disc-shaped, elegant, and moved with a silent propulsion that baffled the Mechanicum adepts. They did not utilize the warp in the crude, brute force manner of the Imperium. Their entry was smooth, precise, and accompanied by the same mathematical broadcasts detected earlier. This was the Interex. The Interex fleet did not open fire immediately, but their posture was undeniably aggressive. They positioned themselves to blockade the planet, their weapon systems locking onto the Imperial vessels with alarming speed. The initial communication was not a greeting, but a chastisement. They transmitted on all frequencies, their message translated by the fleet's linguists as a demand to know why the Imperium had violated the quarantine. To the Interex, the planet Eurosarach was not a world to be conquered, but a prison. They had defeated the megarachnids long ago, stripping them of their interstellar capability and confining them to a single world. The stone spires the Astartes had fought among were not natural formations, but artificial inhibitors, weather-controlled devices designed to generate the atmospheric turbulence that kept the megarachnids grounded and isolated. The diplomatic friction was immediate and intense. The Imperium, operating under the mandate of the Great Crusade, recognized no borders but those of the Emperor's domain. The concept that a human civilization would not only exist independently of Terra, but would also dare to dictate travel restrictions to the War Master, was an affront to the myriad commanders of the 63rd Expedition. First Captain Abaddon and Captain Aximand, members of the War Master's inner circle, the Mournival, viewed the Interex's warning as an insult requiring an immediate military response. They saw a fleet that had failed to bow, and by the binary logic of the Crusade, that made them enemies. However, the Interex's grievance was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of the Imperium's nature. They had detected the distress signals of the Blood Angels and the subsequent violence on the surface, interpreting the Imperial presence not as a crusade of unification, but as a reckless jailbreak. In their eyes, the Imperium had broken the seal on a biological horror they had spent generations containing. They demanded to know if the Imperium was chaos-tainted, a term that caused confusion among the Imperial ranks, who knew the warp only as a hazardous dimension of travel and not by the esoteric definitions of the Interex. The technology displayed by the Interex soldiers, whom they called Sagittars, further complicated the assessment. When surface contact was eventually established, the Imperial forces observed that the Interex troops wore armor that bore a resemblance to centaurs, offering high mobility and heavy protection. They wielded energy weapons, laser bows, and plasma-based projectiles, rather than the mass-reactive bolters favored by the Astartes. More concerning to the Mechanicum representatives was the Interex's use of automated drones and cogitators that appeared to possess a degree of artificial intelligence forbidden by the Treaty of Olympus. They had integrated alien technologies into their society, a heresy in the eyes of the Imperium, yet their society appeared stable, prosperous, and free of mutation. It was here that War Master Horus Lupercal diverged from the standard protocols of the Great Crusade. Under the dictates of the Council of Terra, a non-compliant human civilization refusing immediate submission was to be brought to heel through force. If they harbored xenos or utilized forbidden technology, they were to be purged. Yet Horus hesitated. He looked upon the Interex not with the eyes of a conqueror, but with the eyes of a statesman. The War Master was fascinated. In the Interex, he saw a reflection of what the Great Crusade was striving to achieve, a high-functioning human society that had survived the age of strife with its dignity and technology intact. They were not feral savages worshipping dark idols, nor were they genetic deviants. They were articulate, disciplined, and possessed a martial prowess that commanded respect. Horus, burdened by the immense weight of the Crusade and the increasing isolation he felt from his father, the Emperor, found a spark of hope in this discovery. He theorized that if the Interex could be brought into the Imperial fold peacefully, they would serve as a shining example that the galaxy could be reunited without endless bloodshed. This fascination stood in stark contrast to the compliance protocols ingrained in his subordinates. Where Abaddon saw arrogance, Horus saw pride. Where the Mechanicum saw heresy, Horus saw innovation that could strengthen the Imperium. He ordered his fleet to hold fire, overruling the aggressive instincts of his captains. He initiated a dialogue, leveraging his immense charisma to bridge the cultural gap. He sought to explain the Imperium's mission, framing it not as a conquest, but as a reunion of lost kin. He wanted to understand them, to learn how they had maintained their history and their science when so many others had fallen into darkness. The Interex, for their part, remained deeply suspicious. They were a society that knew of the dangers of the warp, what they called cows, far better than the secular Imperium did. They saw the Astartes, genetically engineered specifically for war, as potential vectors for corruption. The sheer brutality of the imperial method, demonstrated by the slaughter of the megarachnids on Eurosarach, suggested a culture that had embraced violence too readily. They were cautious, keeping their shields raised and their weapons charged, even as they agreed to receive the War Master's delegation. The initial meetings were tense, held under the shadow of the megarachnid conflict. The Interex commanders explained the nature of the reservation, detailing how they had systematically dismantled the megarachnid empire and imprisoned the survivors on Eurosarach as an act of mercy, rather than extermination. This concept baffled many in the Imperial upper command, to whom the existence of a hostile xenos species was a crime that could only be solved by extinction. Horus, however, listened intently. He saw in their mercy a level of cultural maturity that intrigued him. He argued that the Imperium had attacked only in self-defense and to recover their dead, a point the Interex conceded, though they maintained that the Imperium's ignorance of the warning beacons was a sign of dangerous negligence. As the 63rd expedition moved from the Eurosarach system to the Interex homeworlds, specifically the planet Zenobia, the scope of the Interex civilization became clearer. It was a coalition of 30 systems, governed by a meritocracy that valued communication and reason. The streets of their cities were clean, their citizens well-fed and educated. There were no signs of the oppressive industrial slavery that characterized many imperial hive worlds. Horus walked among them, his transhuman stature marking him as a demigod of war, yet he spoke of peace. He engaged in long debates with the Interex leadership, the Dioscuri, attempting to find common ground. The War Master's hope for a peaceful integration was a fragile thing, held together by his will alone. He faced opposition from within his own ranks. The chaplaincy and the more hardline commanders viewed the Interex's tolerance of xenos, specifically the Kindbrak, a subjugated alien race that served as members of Interex society, as an unforgivable sin. The existence of the Kindbrak and their strange, energetic weaponry was a flashpoint. The Imperium's doctrine was suffer not the alien to live, yet here was a human society that had not only suffered them, but integrated them. Horus argued that the Kindbrak were a defeated client race, no different in function than servitors, but the ideological friction was palpable. Despite these hurdles, the negotiations progressed. Horus was determined to prove that the Great Crusade could evolve. He wanted to show the galaxy, and perhaps the Emperor, that there was a better way than fire and sword. He saw the Interex as potential brothers, peers who could stand beside the Imperium against the true darkness of the Void. He invested his personal honor in the talks, spending days in diplomatic functions, visiting their museums, and listening to their music, the same music that had first drawn the fleet across the empty gulfs of space. The tragedy of the Interex lies in this moment of suspended potential. The 63rd expedition, the most powerful military force in human history, paused its relentless advance to extend a hand of friendship. The Interex, guarded and wary, slowly began to lower their defenses, daring to believe that this reunion with the galactic majority might be possible. The atmosphere on Zenobia was one of cautious optimism, overlaid with the heavy, suffocating tension of two apex predators circling one another, neither willing to bare their throat, but both hoping to avoid the kill. The Hall of Devices, a museum dedicated to the weapons of war the Interex had conquered and confiscated, stood as a testament to their philosophy, that war was a disease to be contained, not a glorious destiny. It was here, among the artifacts of the Kindbrak and the relics of Old Night, that the fragile peace would face its ultimate test. But before the betrayal that would shatter this hope, the prevailing mood was one of discovery. The scribes and remembrancers attached to the 63rd expedition scrambled to document this new society, recording the architecture, the language, and the customs of a people who had solved problems the Imperium was still struggling with. They noted the absence of the imperial truth's rigid atheism, replaced by a nuanced understanding of the universe's metaphysical dangers. They noted the technological parity, the way Interex energy grids hummed with an efficiency the Mechanicum coveted. Horus Lupercal stood at the center of this cultural collision, a giant in white and gold, holding back the tide of his own warrior nature. He believed truly and deeply that he could win the Interex without firing a shot. He envisioned a future where the 63rd Expedition and the Interex fleets sailed together, a combined force of enlightenment and power. This vision was the high watermark of the Great Crusade's idealism, a fleeting moment where the dream of unity seemed real, tangible, and within reach, before the galaxy's inherent cruelty conspired to tear it away. The stage was set not for a battle of conquest, but for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, where the noblest intentions of the War Master would be weaponized against him. The discovery in the stars had yielded a mirror, and in it, the Imperium saw a face it did not recognize, a face it would soon be forced to destroy. The transition from the blood-soaked red dust of Urusarach to the orbital space of Zenobia presented a jarring shift in reality for the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. Where the world of the Megarachnids had been a testament to biological horror and atmospheric violence, the Interex homeworld appeared on the viewports of the Imperial vessels as a jewel of calculated perfection. To the eyes of the Astartes and the mortal crews accustomed to the industrial sprawl of Terra or the smog-choked hives of compliant worlds, Zenobia was unnervingly pristine. It was the first physical evidence that the Interex were not merely survivors of the old night, but a civilization that had thrived in isolation, maintaining a trajectory of human development that the Imperium had long since abandoned in favor of total war. The society of the Interex was built upon foundations that seemed alien to the rigidity of the nascent Imperium. While the Great Crusade was forged on the principles of unity through conquest and the absolute authority of the Master of Mankind, the Interex had evolved into a highly sophisticated egalitarian meritocracy. They did not possess the stratification that defined the Emperor's domain, where a planetary governor held life and death power over billions of serfs. Instead, their social structure appeared to be a seamless integration of civic duty and personal liberty, maintained not by the threat of a bolter, but by a shared understanding of their history and the dangers of the galaxy. They were a people who had retained the knowledge of the dark age of technology, but had tempered it with a philosophical maturity that the Mechanicum of Mars would have deemed heretical. This maturity was most visibly expressed in their relationship with technology. The Imperium, scarred by the wars against the Men of Iron, had retreated into a dogma of ritualized maintenance and a fear of the abominable intelligence. The Interex, conversely, utilized automation with a fluidity that baffled the tech priests attached to Horus's fleet. On Zenobia, there were no servitors, no lobotomized criminals hardwired into doors or gun emplacements, a sight so common in the Imperium that it went unnoticed by its citizens. The Interex regarded the concept of the servitor as barbaric. Their labor was performed by advanced drones and non-sentient automated systems that handled the drudgery of existence, freeing the human population to pursue art, science, and martial excellence. This reliance on automation was not the reckless hubris of the past, but a carefully managed symbiotic relationship, suggesting they had solved the control problems that had once brought humanity to its knees. The cultural heartbeat of this civilization was the aria. To the initial Imperial listeners, it had seemed like mere background noise or an artistic affectation, but closer inspection by the remembrancers and iterators revealed it to be the primary method of Interex communication and record-keeping. The aria was a constant, multi-layered broadcast that permeated every level of their society. It was a language of mathematics and melody, a sonic web that conveyed information, emotional context, and news in real time. Where the Imperium relied on parchment, vox grills, and the binary cant of the priesthood of Mars, the Interex transmitted their culture through song. This method of communication spoke to a fundamental difference in how the two branches of humanity processed information. The aria was subtle and pervasive. A citizen of the Interex walking through a plaza on Zenobia was constantly receiving data regarding weather patterns, resource allocation, and social updates, all encoded within harmonious frequencies that the uninitiated ear would mistake for ambient music. It suggested a populace with a high baseline of cognitive enhancement or genetic manipulation, capable of parsing complex data streams subconsciously. For the diplomats of the 63rd Expedition, this created a formidable barrier. They were attempting to negotiate with a species that communicated in a spectrum they could barely perceive, let alone interpret. The Aria unified the Interex in a way the Imperial truth tried to achieve through rhetoric. It was a shared consciousness that allowed for rapid societal shifts and a cohesive response to threats, devoid of the bureaucratic lag that plagued Imperial administration. The architectural landscape of the Interex reflected this obsession with harmony and mathematics. The cities of Zenobia did not scrape the sky in a desperate bid for space, nor did they dig deep into the crust to hide from the elements. They were integrated into the natural environment with an elegance that made the brutalist, Gothic style of the Imperium look crude and unfinished. Buildings were constructed from materials that shimmered with a pearlescent quality, shaped into curves and flutes that followed the golden ratio. There were no gargoyles, no skulls, and no oppressive iconography designed to intimidate the viewer. The structures were airy, open to the elements, and surrounded by extensive parklands. This integration with nature was a stark contrast to the Imperial method of taming a world, which usually involved paving over the biosphere with ceramite and plasteel. The Interex cities were garden cities, where technology and biology coexisted. The air was clean, scrubbed of pollutants by atmospheric regulators that were far more efficient and less intrusive than the immense manufactorum stacks of a Forge world. To the Astartes of the Luna Wolves, walking the streets of Zenobia felt like walking through a fragile dream. The scale was human, not monumental. The wide boulevards were designed for foot traffic and sleek, grav suspension vehicles, not for the tread of super-heavy tanks or the march of millions of soldiers. It was a society that did not expect to be invaded, or rather, believed its outer defenses were so absolute that the core worlds could afford the luxury of peace. The aesthetic extended to the people themselves. The citizens of the Interex were physically impressive, tall and healthy, showing none of the signs of malnutrition or industrial disease common to the lower decks of Imperial starships. They favored clothing that was simple yet functional, often incorporating small technological weaves that interfaced with the Aria. Their soldiers, the Sagittars, wore armor that was a marvel of engineering. Unlike the bulky, reactor-driven power armor of the Space Marines, Interex armor was form-fitting and comprised of interlocking plates that offered exceptional mobility. The design often incorporated a lower body apparatus that gave them a centaur-like silhouette, providing a stable firing platform for their energy weapons while allowing for rapid redeployment. These were not shock troops designed for terror. They were precision instruments of war, mirroring the society that created them. At the apex of this society sat a leadership structure that defied the feudal expectations of the Imperium. The Interex was governed by a council of peers, often referred to by the Imperial translators as the Dioscuri, though this term likely simplified a more complex hierarchy. Leadership was not hereditary, nor was it seized through violence. It was meritocratic, awarded to those who demonstrated the greatest capacity for logic, strategy, and the protection of the populace. This absence of a single autocrat was puzzling to the commanders of the 63rd Expedition, who were conditioned to answer to a Primarch, and ultimately to the Emperor. The Interex viewed the concentration of power in a single individual as a historical error, a pathway to the very corruption they had spent millennia guarding against. This corruption was the defining pivot point of their entire culture. The Interex were aware of the warp. Unlike the Imperial truth, which sought to starve the entities of the Imperium by denying their existence and enforcing a rigid secularism, the Interex practiced a doctrine of education and vigilance. They referred to the threat as cows. They understood that the warp was not merely a dimension of travel, but a predatory realm capable of corrupting the human soul. Their entire society, their aria, their mental discipline, their refusal to use crude warp drives, was structured to minimize their footprint in the Imperium. This knowledge made their society incredibly resilient, but also deeply paranoid. They did not police their citizens with arbitrators or secret police because the discipline was internal. Every citizen was educated on the dangers of cows from birth. They viewed the warp as a natural hazard, akin to radiation or a virus, which could be managed through caution and technology. This stood in violent opposition to the imperial method, where ignorance was the primary defense and only the elite were privy to the true nature of the threat. To the Interex, the Imperium's reckless use of the warp for travel and communication, combined with their ignorance of its true nature, made the Crusade fleets appear like children playing with a loaded weapon. The most controversial aspect of Interex society, however, was their integration of xenos species. This was the antithesis of the Great Crusade's manifest destiny. The Interex had defeated the Kindbrak, a species of large, simian-like warriors, but instead of exterminating them, they had absorbed them. The Kindbrak lived among the humans of the Interex as a client race, serving as shock troops and craftsmen. This relationship was not one of equal partnership, but neither was it chattel slavery. The Kindbrak were respected for their martial prowess and their metallurgy, specifically their ability to forge weapons that resonated with the warp, devices the Interex kept under strict lock and key in museum armories like the Hall of Devices. To the eyes of the 16th Legion, seeing aliens walking freely on a human world was an affront to the natural order. Yet the Interex argued that the Kindbrak had been disarmed culturally. By integrating them, the Interex believed they had neutralized the threat more effectively than genocide ever could. This philosophy highlighted the fundamental divergence between the two civilizations. The Imperium sought security through the elimination of the other, while the Interex sought security through the control and assimilation of the other. The Hall of Devices on Zenobia served as the physical manifestation of this philosophy. It was a museum, but to the Imperial mindset, it looked like an unguarded armory. Here, the Interex displayed the weapons of the wars they had won, including the cursed blades of the Kindbrak and artifacts of Pure Cow's corruption. The weapons were not destroyed, but kept as reminders of the vigilance required to survive. The museum was open to the public, a testament to the Interex's trust in their own citizens. They believed that hiding the danger made it alluring, whereas exposing it, analyzing it, and explaining it rendered it mundane and manageable. It was a sterile, brightly lit environment where things that could drive a man insane were labeled and cataloged behind stasis fields, treated as historical footnotes rather than metaphysical horrors. The technology found within the hall and in the hands of the Interex military showcased a divergent evolution from the standard template constructs sought by the Imperium. Their weaponry was primarily energy-based, utilizing coherent light and plasma in refined formats that outstripped the stopping power of standard Imperial lasguns. Their laser bows, used by the Sagitors, were silent and deadly, capable of piercing power armor at the joints. They utilized personal shielding technology that was rare even among the Astartes legions, but it was their medical and biological science that truly demonstrated their advancement. They had cured the genetic defects that plagued populations on industrial worlds. They had mastered their own biology without resorting to the brute force genetic engineering that created the Space Marines. An Interex citizen was a baseline human, but a baseline human operating at the absolute peak of genetic potential. This high standard of living and technological prowess created a society that was confident, perhaps to the point of arrogance. When the diplomats of the Interex spoke to the War Master's envoys, they did not speak as inferiors or supplicants. They spoke as equals, and in some cases, as elders scolding a reckless younger sibling. They looked at the Imperium, with its skull iconography, its servitors, its warrior monks, and its blind aggression, and saw a society that had regressed into barbarism, masking its degradation with the trappings of technology. They saw the Imperium's unity as a hollow shell, a military occupation rather than a cultural enlightenment. The tension in the diplomatic meetings was fueled by this cultural mismatch. The Interex could not understand why the Imperium was so eager to kill, and the Imperium could not understand why the Interex was so willing to tolerate the intolerable. The Interex negotiators, often communicating via the melodic intonations of the aria, which translators struggled to render into low Gothic, asked probing questions about the source of the Imperium's power. They asked about the Emperor, not as a god, but as a warlord. They asked about the Astartes, questioning the wisdom of creating a caste of transhuman killers who knew nothing of peace. These questions struck a nerve, particularly with the Astartes of the Mournival, who viewed their existence as the ultimate expression of human will. Yet, despite the friction, the sheer success of the Interex society was undeniable. They had maintained a multi-system empire for thousands of years. They had kept the darkness of old night at bay without sacrificing their humanity. In the clean streets of Zenobia, where music carried the news and aliens walked in service to man, the 63rd expedition saw a mirror image of what they might have become if history had taken a different turn. It was a vision of humanity that was rational, calm, and scientifically literate, devoid of the superstition and feudal brutality that was necessary to hold the Imperium together. The existence of the Interex challenged the core tenet of the Great Crusade, that the Emperor's way was the only way for humanity to survive. Here was proof that it was not. Here was a civilization that had survived without the imperial truth, without the Lectitio Divinitatis, and without the Primarchs. This realization was dangerous. It suggested that the galaxy was not a binary choice between the Imperium and extinction. It offered a third path, one of nuance and integration. For War Master Horus, this was a revelation that fueled his desire for peaceful compliance. If he could bring this society into the fold intact, he would not only gain their technology, but also validate the idea that the Crusade could be a force for preservation rather than just destruction. However, the very openness of Interex society, the trait that made them so appealing to the War Master, was also their greatest vulnerability in the face of the galaxy's darker truths. Their meritocracy relied on trust. Their communication relied on the Arya's truthfulness. Their containment of the Kindbrak and Cow's artifacts relied on the assumption that no one would be mad enough to weaponize them willingly. They had built a society that was immune to accidental corruption, but had no defense against deliberate, calculated betrayal from within. They assumed that because they were rational, any other human faction must ultimately be rational as well. They looked at the Astartes and saw fellow soldiers, not realizing that among the fleet lay agents of powers they believed they had scientifically categorized and dismissed. The cultural exchange continued under this cloud of mutual fascination and suspicion. Imperial remembrancers sketched the fluted towers and recorded the haunting melodies of the aria, trying to capture the essence of a culture that felt like a lost golden age. Interex scriveners and automated drones analyzed the rugged machinery of the Imperial fleet, looking for the common ancestry in the STC fragments. It was a moment of breathless possibility, where the two greatest fragments of humanity stood on the precipice of reunification. The Interex offered the Imperium a lesson in what it meant to be civilized, while the Imperium offered the Interex the raw strength required to dominate a hostile galaxy. It was a puzzle where the pieces seemed to fit, provided one ignored the jagged edges of ideology that threatened to cut the hands of anyone trying to force them together. The technological disparity between the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet and the Interex civilization was not merely a matter of aesthetic preference or resource allocation. It was a fundamental divergence in the application of the standard template construct, the ancient database of human knowledge that served as the holy grail for the Adeptus Mechanicus. While the tech priests of Mars viewed the STC fragments as sacred texts to be recovered and replicated with dogmatic precision, the Interex had treated the same foundational data as a living science, subject to refinement, evolution, and improvement. To the adepts serving aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the machinery of Zenobia represented a blasphemous paradox. It was undeniably human in origin, yet it functioned with a seamless efficiency that the Imperium had lost during the anarchy of the Age of Strife. The most immediate visual distinction lay in the construction philosophy. Imperial technology, from the humble lasgun to the mighty Titan, was characterized by a brutalist durability, riveted plates, exposed cabling, visible weld lines, and a Gothic ornamentation that celebrated the machine as a beast of burden. It was technology built for a galaxy of endless war, designed to be repaired with a hammer and prayer in the mud of a trench. The Interex, conversely, had retained the sleeker, more sophisticated design ethos of the dark age of technology. Their devices lacked visible seams or rivets, utilizing advanced bonding techniques that fused materials at a molecular level. Where an Imperial cogitator was a massive, clunking bank of brass and vacuum tubes, Interex computing hardware was integrated into the architecture itself, silent and unobtrusive, utilizing crystalline storage matrices that far outstripped the data density of Mechanicum memory coils. This retention of lost technology was most evident in their mastery of miniaturization and power generation. The Imperium relied heavily on plasma reactors that were volatile and prone to catastrophic failure if not appeased with specific rituals, or promethium engines that belched toxic fumes. The Interex utilized power cells of unknown composition, compact, high-output units that hummed with a clean, white energy. This allowed personal wargear to function for extended periods without the need for the heavy, backpack-mounted power plants required by Imperial stormtroopers or the Astartes power armor. The adepts of the Mechanicum, viewing scans of Interex energy grids, noted with a mix of envy and revulsion that the efficiency ratings defied the laws of thermodynamics as understood by the cult Mechanicus, suggesting the use of subatomic manipulation that had been forbidden by the Emperor's own decrees regarding dangerous innovation. The divergence was most acutely demonstrated in the personal armaments and armor of the Interex warrior caste, the Sagitars. To the Astartes of the Luna Wolves, accustomed to the mass reactive roar of the bolter and the chainsword's visceral tear, the Interex method of war seemed initially underwhelming, almost fragile. This assessment was a dangerous underestimation born of cultural bias. The standard issue weapon for the Sagittar was a device the Imperials classified as a laser crossbow or laser bow. Unlike the standard Imperial lasgun, which fired rapid pulses of coherent light capable of causing thermal damage to unarmored flesh, the Interex weapon was a precision instrument of assassination. The laser bow operated on a principle of focused, high-intensity discharge that was completely silent. There was no crack of ozone, no thunderous report, only a momentary distortion in the air and the sudden disintegration of the target point. The weapon utilized a tenuous physical guide, often a monofilament wire or magnetic rail, to channel the energy, allowing for a level of armor penetration that rivaled the plasma weaponry of the Legion's Astartes, but without the risk of overheating. During the initial skirmishes on Urusarach against the Megarachnids, Imperial observers noted that these laser bolts could punch through the dense chitin of the xenos with surgical ease, cauterizing the wound instantly. Against ceramite, the effect was equally concerning. The beam did not shatter the plate like a bolt shell, but drilled through it, superheating the armor and the flesh beneath in a microsecond. The armor worn by the Sagittars further highlighted the difference in combat doctrine. Imperial power armor was a shell, a walking tank designed to make the wearer impervious to small arms and environmental hazards through sheer thickness of plasteel and ceramite. It turned the Astartes into a battering ram. Interex armor, by contrast, was a second skin. It was composed of interlocking, articulate plates of a white, ceramic-like composite that offered high tensile strength while maintaining a low-weight profile. It relied on deflection and dispersion of kinetic energy rather than absorption. The most radical element of their wargear, however, was the Centaur battlesuit configuration. This was not a biological mutation, a fact that had to be rigorously verified by the 63rd Expedition's apothecaries to prevent an immediate purge order. The Interex soldiers were baseline humans, but they piloted combat rigs that locked into their lower bodies, effectively replacing their legs with a four-legged mechanical chassis. This apparatus provided a stable, mobile firing platform that could traverse broken terrain with the agility of a mountain goat, while supporting the weight of heavy support weapons that would normally require a two-man team or a tripod setup in the Imperial Guard. The Centaur suits were integrated with the wearer's nervous system through spinal interfaces that were far less invasive than the crude black carapace implants of the Space Marines or the hard plugs of the Titan Princeps. The connection allowed the Sagittar to control the mechanical limbs as if they were their own biological appendages. In motion, these units could outpace a Space Marine in full sprint, capable of rapid lateral shifts and elevated jumps that made them difficult to target. The tactical advantage was significant. A Sagittar could fire heavy weaponry on the move with perfect stability, retreating or flanking without pausing to brace. This fusion of man and machine was elegant, devoid of the body horror associated with the Servitors or the cybernetic resurrection of the Iron Hand's 10th Legion. It was technology serving humanity, rather than humanity sacrificing itself to the machine. Complementing these biological-mechanical hybrids was the extensive use of automated drone technology. In the Imperium, true artificial intelligence was the ultimate heresy, the abominable intelligence that had nearly destroyed mankind during the cybernetic revolt. Consequently, Imperial automation was wetware-based. Lobotomized human brains were used to process targeting data or open blast doors. The Interex had no such taboo. They employed purely mechanical drones for combat support, reconnaissance, and atmospheric defense. These drones were disc-shaped or ovoid, hovering silently on anti-gravitic suspensors similar to those found on the Archaeotech jetbikes used by the Sky Hunter squads of the legions, but significantly more refined. They operated in networked swarms, sharing target data and sensor sweeps instantaneously via the ARIA. On the battlefield, these drones acted as force multipliers for the Sagitors, projecting energy shields to cover an advance or laying down suppressing fire with smaller variants of the laser weaponry. The terrifying aspect for the Imperial strategists was the autonomy of these machines. They did not appear to require direct remote control. They reacted to battlefield conditions with a logic and speed that suggested a learning cogitator core. To the Mechanicum, these were silica animus, soulless minds that mocked the sanctity of life. To the Interex, they were simply tools, efficient and expendable, ensuring that human lives were not wasted in the grinder of attrition warfare. This preference for mobility and precision over attrition defined the Interex strategic mindset. The Imperium conquered by hammering a foe until they broke, utilizing the inexhaustible manpower of the Imperial army and the transhuman resilience of the Astartes. The Interex fought to neutralize threats with minimal expenditure of resources. Their cavalry units, the Sagittars in their centaur suits, would conduct hit-and-run attacks, using their speed and the silent lethality of their laser bows to disable enemy command structures and heavy weapons before the main force could engage. They did not hold ground for the sake of honor. They controlled the flow of battle, drawing enemies into kill zones orchestrated by their drone networks. It was a combat doctrine of fencing rather than bludgeoning, relying on superior information processing and reaction times. The technological chasm was perhaps widest in the domain of void travel. The Great Crusade was built upon the back of the warp drive and the navigator gene. To cross the galaxy, Imperial ships tore a hole in reality and plunged into the Imperium, a hellscape of psychic energy where the laws of physics dissolved. They were guided through this madness by the navigators, mutants sanctioned by the Emperor to perceive the light of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon projected from Terra. It was a method of travel that was fast, dangerous, and inherently corrupting, requiring Geller fields to keep the demons at bay. The Interex viewed this method of travel as insanity. They possessed a keen awareness of the warp's predatory nature, what they called cows, and had structured their entire civilization to avoid direct exposure to it. They did not use navigators. In fact, the Interex had likely purged the navigator mutation from their gene pool millennia ago, viewing it as a vector for corruption. Instead, they utilized a system of subspace gates and automated beacons. Their method involved skimming the very edge of the warp, dipping into the sublayer of reality just deep enough to bypass the constraints of relativity, but shallow enough to avoid the attention of the entities that dwelt within the deep immaterium. This warp skimming was slower than the deep dive jumps of the Imperial fleets, limiting the expansion rate of the Interex Empire. They could not leap across the galaxy in a few months. Their domain was a local cluster of 30 systems, tightly knit and heavily defended. To facilitate this travel, the Interex maintained a network of sophisticated gravitational beacons positioned at the periphery of their systems. These beacons acted as lighthouses and anchors, creating stable corridors through the void, artificial currents that their ships could ride. A vessel would translate from real space at a specific vector indicated by the beacon, entering a calculated trajectory that carried it safely to the next node in the network. The calculation was handled by non-biological cogitators, removing the need for a psychic pilot. This system rendered the Interex immune to the whims of the warp storms that frequently becalmed or scattered Imperial fleets. Their arrival times were mathematically predictable, their transit routes stable. However, it also meant their strategic mobility was tethered to infrastructure. An Imperial fleet could jump into an uncharted system, provided the navigator could see the astronomicon. An Interex fleet could only travel where the beacons had been established, or where they could slowly probe their way forward to build new ones. This limitation explained their isolation. They were not explorers in the reckless sense of the rogue traders, but gardeners, slowly expanding a safe zone of reality against the encroaching dark. The ships themselves reflected this difference in propulsion. Imperial battleships were cathedral-like fortresses, designed with massive prows to plow through the psychic tides of the warp. They were heavily shielded and armored to withstand the pressures of the Imperium. Interex vessels were disc-shaped or crescent-like, aerodynamic in a way that applied to etheric currents rather than atmosphere. They lacked the massive Geller field generators of the Imperium, relying instead on cloaking technologies that masked their sole signature from the warp's denizens. They moved silently, their engines emitting no radiant heat or plasma exhaust, utilizing a form of gravitic impellers that allowed them to accelerate with impossible smoothness. When the vengeful spirit had first detected the Interex fleet, the sensors had struggled to maintain a lock not because of jamming, but because the Interex ships generated almost no emissions. They were ghosts in the void, designed to slip unnoticed past the horrors of the galaxy rather than challenging them to a brawl. This stealth capability, combined with their precise, long-range directed energy weapons, made them formidable opponents in a void war. An Imperial macro cannon battery relied on massed volleys to overwhelm void shields. An Interex vessel could theoretically disable an Imperial ship's engines with a precise lance strike from outside standard engagement range, all while remaining difficult to track on auspex. The absence of astropaths was another critical divergence. The Imperium communicated across interstellar distances using blind, psychic choirs that screamed coded messages through the warp, a method that was prone to distortion, time dilation, and demonic interception. The Interex used the same beacon network that guided their ships to transmit data. These were tight beam, subspace transmissions, encrypted with mathematical complexity that baffled the Imperial cryptographers. While slower than astropathic communication, limited by the propagation speed through the subspace tunnels, the signal clarity was absolute. An Interex message sent from Zenobia to the edge of their space arrived exactly as it was sent, without the metaphorical imagery or nightmare taint that often accompanied astropathic dreams. The Mechanicum representatives attached to the 63rd expedition, particularly the senior adepts like Regulus, looked upon these technologies with a hunger that bordered on mania. They saw the Interex not just as a rival civilization, but as a repository of the Omnissiah's lost gifts. The automated manufacturing spires of Zenobia, which produced goods without the need for indentured labor, the medical bays that healed wounds with light and sonic resonance rather than amputation and prosthetics, the agricultural drones that tended the garden cities, all of it was evidence of an STC lineage that had remained pure, uncorrupted by the desperate scrambling of the age of strife. Yet, to the more orthodox members of the Mechanicum, this purity was itself a heresy. The Interex had innovated. They had taken the STC designs and altered them, improved them, and integrated them with alien technologies, specifically the metallurgy of the Kindbrak. The blades and energy conductors found in the Interex armories contained alloys that did not exist on the periodic table of elements known to Terra. This was xenoromos, the forbidden mixing of human and alien tech. It was the ultimate crime against the machine god's rigid dogma. The Interex claimed these modifications were necessary improvements. The Mechanicum saw them as the defilement of a holy template. The tension was further exacerbated by the Interex's use of the Aria for technological interface. Imperial technology was activated by runes, switches, and binary cant. Interex technology responded to specific sonic frequencies and harmonies. A Sagittarius weapon was tuned to the user's biorhythm and unlocked via a sub-vocalized chord. The city's defenses were modulated by the changing tempo of the planetary broadcast. This suggested a synthesis of technology and culture that the Imperium could barely comprehend. The Imperium used technology to enforce order, the Interex used technology to facilitate harmony. For the Astartes, the practical implications of a conflict were sobering. The simulations run by the tactical cogitators of the 16th Legion showed that while the Imperium possessed vastly superior numbers and heavier tonnage, a campaign against the Interex would be costly. The enemy could not be easily pinned down. Their supply lines were automated and efficient. Their communications were unbreakable. And their weapons, while lacking the terror factor of the bolter, were capable of killing a space marine with a single, well-placed shot to the lens or neck seal. The Centaur suits gave them a mobility advantage in urban combat that negated the shock assault tactics the Luna Wolves favored. This technological mastery painted a picture of a civilization that had won the game of survival by changing the rules. They had rejected the brute force trauma of the Imperium in favor of finesse and sustainability. They had traded the galaxy-spanning ambition of the Great Crusade for a secure, highly advanced regional hegemony. They did not need to conquer the stars because they had mastered their own backyard. To Horus Lupercal, this mastery was the ultimate prize. If the Interex could be integrated, their non-warp drive technology could stabilize the Imperium's supply lines. Their medical tech could enhance the gene seed implantation process. Their automated drones could replace the inefficient slave labor of the Hive worlds. The potential for a golden age was written in the sleek lines of their ships and the silent hum of their power cells, provided the two divergent paths of humanity did not destroy each other first. The psychological impact of the Interex civilization on the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet was compounded by the physical presence of the Kindbrak. While the technological heresies of the Interex, their automated drones, their lack of navigators, and their reliance on the musical aria could be intellectualized by the Imperial command as divergent evolution, the Kindbrak represented a visceral violation of the Great Crusade's most fundamental tenet. To the Astartes and the baseline humans of the Imperium, the galaxy was a dark forest where humanity was the sole rightful predator. Every other sapient species was a potential extinction event waiting to happen, a rival for resources and survival that had to be eliminated before it could strike. The mere existence of the Kindbrak on Zenobia, walking unmolested through the pearlescent streets of the capital city, was an affront to the indoctrination that had fueled the expansion of the Imperium from the Sol system to the galactic fringe. The Kindbrak were not a subtle species. They were large, hulking entities that possessed a physiology distinct from the bipedal symmetry of humanity. Resembling the great apes of Terra's prehistory, but evolved for a darker, more violent purpose, they possessed massive, overdeveloped shoulders and long, powerful arms that hung low to the ground, allowing them to switch between a lumbering bipedal gait and a knuckle-walking charge with terrifying speed. Their bodies were covered in thick, coarse hair, and their faces were broad, flat masks of leathery skin, dominated by deep-set eyes that held a glimmer of intelligence completely alien to the human observer. They smelled of musk and oil, a primal scent that triggered the aggressive instincts of the Astartes' enhanced senses, causing the post-human warriors to tighten their grips on their bolters whenever one of the creatures passed nearby. The history of the Kindbrak and the Interex was not one of peaceful first contact, but of a brutal and protracted war that had defined the early expansion of the Interex coalition. Long before the arrival of the 63rd Expedition, the Interex had encountered the Kindbrak Empire in a neighboring star cluster. At that time, the Kindbrak were a dominant regional power, possessed of a cruel and sophisticated culture that reveled in warfare. They were not merely brutes, they were master metallurgists and weaponsmiths who had dabbled in technologies that touched upon the warp, crafting blades and devices that defied the laws of material physics. The war between the two species had been existential. The Kindbrak had sought to enslave the human populations they encountered, viewing them as weak, hairless cattle. The Interex, utilizing their superior mobility and their mastery of ranged energy warfare, had fought back with the desperate resolve of a species facing extinction. The conflict had raged for decades, consuming entire systems. It was a crucible that had forged the modern Interex military, forcing them to adapt their tactics to counter the sheer ferocity and resilience of the Kindbrak shock troops. The turning point came not through the total annihilation of the enemy homeworlds, which was the standard Imperial doctrine, but through a systematic dismantling of the Kindbrack's ability to wage war. The Interex realized that the Kindbrack society was caste-based and deeply ritualistic. By targeting their leadership and severing their connection to their dark technologies, the Interex broke the Kindbrack's will to fight. In the aftermath of their victory, the Interex leadership, the Dioscuri, made a decision that would eventually condemn them in the eyes of the Imperium. They chose not to exterminate the Kindbrack. They reasoned that genocide was the resort of a primitive mind, an admission that one lacked the strength or the wisdom to control a defeated foe. Instead, they initiated a program of integration. They absorbed the remnants of the Kindbrack civilization into their own, stripping them of their independent governance and their warp-tainted forges, but allowing them to live. Over generations, the Kindbrack were conditioned to serve. They were transformed from conquerors into a client race, a species of indentured citizens who contributed their strength and their craftsmanship to the society that had defeated them. This integration was total. On Zenobia, the Kindbrack served as the heavy laborers, the bodyguards, and the artisans of the Interex. They wore the sashes and heraldry of the Interex noble houses, marking them not as slaves in chains, but as members of the household, albeit of a lower caste. They were permitted to bear arms, specifically the heavy, curved blades that were their cultural heritage, but only in the service of their human masters. To the Interex, this was the ultimate proof of their civilization's superiority. They had taken a nightmare out of the dark and tamed it. They had turned a wolf into a hound. To the Imperial observers, however, this relationship was an abomination. Captain Garville Loken of the Luna Wolves, a warrior of deep introspection and conscience, found the sight of the Kindbrack deeply unsettling. During the diplomatic tour of Zenobia, Loken and his fellow Mournival members, Ezekiel Abaddon, Tariq Torgeddon, and Horus Aximand, witnessed humans and aliens interacting with a casual familiarity that made their skin crawl. They saw Kindbrack warriors standing sentry outside the crystalline towers of the Interex governance, their alien eyes scanning the crowd with a protective gaze directed at the humans they served. They saw Kindbrack artisans working in open-air forges, using their immense strength to shape alloys that human hands could not bend, creating works of art and utility that were celebrated by the Interex populace. The revulsion felt by the Astartes was not merely biological xenophobia, it was ideological. The Great Crusade was built on the binary truth that the alien was the enemy. The Emperor had decreed that humanity could only be safe when it stood alone among the stars. To see a human society that had not only spared the alien, but integrated it suggested a betrayal of the species. It implied that coexistence was possible, a concept that undermined the justification for the endless wars of extermination the legions had waged for 2 centuries. Abaddon, in particular, viewed the Kindbrack with open hostility. To the first captain of the 16th Legion, the Kindbrack were a ticking bomb. He saw their submission as a ruse, or at best, a temporary state. In his eyes, a predator does not become a pet. It merely waits for the hand that holds the leash to weaken. The friction was palpable during the visit to the Hall of Devices, the great museum armory of the Interex. This sprawling complex was the repository of the Interex's history, a place where they displayed the weapons and technologies they had conquered and decommissioned. It was here that the true nature of the Kindbrack's past was laid bare. The halls were lined with display cases containing the cow's artifacts of the Kindbrack Wars, weapons forged with techniques that made the air around them shimmer with an oily sickness. These were the anathems and their kin, blades that could cut through reality and poison the soul. The Interex guides, speaking with the melodic cadence of the aria, explained to the horrified Imperial delegation that the Kindbrack had once worshipped the cow's entities, channeling the power of the warp into their steel. They explained that part of the integration process had been the cultural disarmament of the species. The Kindbrack were forbidden from forging these weapons ever again. The secrets of their creation were locked away, and the existing artifacts were kept in the Hall of Devices as a reminder of the dangers of the Imperium. The Kindbrack who worked in the museum, polishing the glass cases that held the instruments of their ancestors' damnation, were presented as rehabilitated sinners, living proof that education and order could triumph over chaotic nature. For the Luna Wolves, this explanation did little to assuage their disgust. If anything, it deepened it. the revelation that the Kindbrak were not just aliens, but aliens who had actively trafficked with the warp made their continued existence intolerable. The chaplaincy of the word-bearers, represented in the fleet by First Chaplain Erebus, took a keen and malicious interest in this. While the Luna Wolves saw a military threat, Erebus saw opportunity. He recognized the Kindbrak weaponry for what it was, tools of the dark gods, preserved in pristine condition by a society that arrogantly believed it could study evil without being touched by it. The presence of the Kindbrak also complicated the diplomatic narrative Horus was trying to spin. The War Master was attempting to present the Interex as a lost branch of humanity that could be brought into the fold without bloodshed. He argued to his captains that the Kindbrak were effectively gelded, no different in function than the cybernetic combat servitors of the Mechanicum or the genetically lobotomized Ogrins used by the Imperial Army. He tried to frame them as tools rather than citizens, but the reality on the ground contradicted him. The Interex treated the Kindbrak with respect. They spoke to them. They acknowledged them. This was not the relationship between a mechanic and a machine. It was a societal compact. This philosophical divide created a tension that permeated every interaction. When the Interex offered gifts of Kindbrak craftsmanship, non-warp tainted blades of exceptional sharpness, the Astartes accepted them with stiff formality, treating the objects as if they were radioactive. They could not separate the object from the maker. To handle a weapon forged by xenos' hands was to invite a subtle corruption. The Interex, perceiving this hesitation, viewed the Astartes as superstitious and immature. They saw the imperial fear of the alien as a childish phobia, a lack of confidence in one's own cultural dominance. They believed that a truly strong civilization had nothing to fear from the service of a lesser species. The role of the Kindbrak as warriors was the most contentious issue. The Interex maintained elite units of Kindbrak shock troops, utilized for their brute strength in close-quarters engagements where the elegant Sagittars might be at a disadvantage. These units were disciplined, following orders with a loyalty that seemed absolute. Imperial tactical assessments noted that a squad of Kindbrak, armored in Interex plate and wielding power blades, would be a match for anything short of an Astartes squad. The idea of humans fighting alongside xenos against a common foe was anathema to the Imperial military doctrine. It raised the question, if the Interex were attacked by orcs or Eldar, would the Kindbrak fight for humanity? The Interex insisted they would. The Imperium insisted that blood would eventually call to blood, and the Kindbrak would turn. Garville Loken's interactions with the Kindbrak were particularly telling of the tragedy to come. As he walked the halls of the museum, he found himself staring into the eyes of a Kindbrak curator. He looked for malice, for the beast he had been trained to kill. Instead, he found a quiet, mournful dignity. The creature did not snarl. It simply went about its duties with a slow, deliberate grace. This cognitive dissonance gnawed at Loken. It forced him to question whether the Great Crusade's definition of monster was too broad. If a xenos could be taught to live in peace, to build rather than destroy, was its extermination truly justice? Or was it merely murder? These were dangerous thoughts, bordering on heresy, and Loken pushed them down, retreating into the certainty of his transhuman purpose. But the seed of doubt had been planted, not by words, but by the silent, towering presence of the ape-like artisans. The Kindbrak integration was the ultimate test of the Imperium's flexibility, a test it was destined to fail. The Interex had solved the xenos problem through culture and science. The Imperium only knew how to solve it through fire. The existence of the Kindbrak on Zenobia was the wedge that prevented true understanding between the two human factions. Horus could overlook the technology, and he could debate the nature of the warp, but he could not easily explain away the aliens standing guard over human children in the parks of the capital city. It was a visual symbol of the Interex's deviation, a constant reminder that these people, for all their shared ancestry, had walked a very different path during the long night. Furthermore, the Kindbrak served as the unwitting catalyst for the fall. Their presence provided the mechanism for the betrayal that was forming in the shadows. The Anatheme, the Kindbrak blade that would eventually fell a Primarch, was resting in its stasis field, a weapon of xenos manufacture protected by human hubris. The Interex believed they had sterilized the Kindbrak threat by removing their ability to make new weapons, failing to realize that keeping the old ones as museum pieces was an invitation to disaster. They had domesticated the warrior, but they had enshrined the sword. In the end, the Kindbrak were a tragic element in the tapestry of the 63rd expedition. They were a defeated people who had found a second life as servants, only to find themselves caught between two apex predators, the benevolent but arrogant masters who had conquered them, and the intolerant crusaders who had arrived from the stars to judge them. Their silence in the narrative is deafening. They do not speak in the records, they only serve, loom, and die. They are the background radiation of the Interex tragedy, the proof that the galaxy was far more complex than the Emperor's truth allowed, and that complexity was something the Imperium was not equipped to handle without drawing its bolters. The integration of the Kindbrak was the Interex's greatest social achievement, and it became their death warrant. The unease generated by the physical presence of the Kindbrak was merely the surface tension of a much deeper ideological abyss that separated the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet from their hosts. While the Astartes of the 16th Legion struggled with the visceral reality of xenos integration, the true point of divergence lay in the theoretical and spiritual framework the Interex used to navigate the galaxy. As the diplomatic envoys and their transhuman escorts ventured deeper into the cultural heart of Zenobia, specifically within the echoing, sterile galleries of the Hall of Devices, they encountered a word that would eventually become the death knell of the nascent alliance. That word was cows. To the Imperium of man, the warp was a utility and a hazard, a dimensional anomaly used for travel and communication, understood through the lens of the imperial truth. The Emperor had taught his sons and his subjects that the galaxy was rational, governed by laws of science and logic. The entities that dwelt within the Imperium were classified as xenos forms, energetic parasites, or mindless storms of psychic residue. They were dangerous, certainly, but they were not divine, nor were they sentient in a way that warranted superstition. The imperial truth was a shield of ignorance, forged to starve these entities of belief by denying their metaphysical significance. The Interex held a diametrically opposed view, one born of hard-won survival rather than enforced secularism. They did not deny the spiritual nature of the warp, they defined it with clinical precision. To them, the warp was cows, a phonetic distinction that carried with it a specific set of warnings and protocols. They recognized the Imperium not merely as a turbulent sea to be sailed, but as a multidimensional predator, a sentient hazard that actively sought to breach the material realm and corrupt biological life. They viewed cows as the great enemy, a force of unmaking that was as natural as gravity, but as deadly as a plague. This understanding was not the preserve of a priestly caste or a secret order of inquisitors. It was the bedrock of Interex education. From the moment a citizen of Zenobia was old enough to comprehend the aria, they were taught about the dangers of the emotional spectrum. They were instructed that strong, unchecked emotions, rage, excess, despair, ambition, were the beacons that drew the attention of cows. The society was structured around emotional regulation and mental discipline, not to suppress humanity, but to armor it. Vigilance was their watchword. They believed that a citizenry aware of the danger was a citizenry that could defend against it. This approach baffled the imperial delegates. When War Master Horus and his Mournival engaged the Interex commanders in debate, the openness with which the Interex discussed the corruption of the soul seemed dangerously close to the superstition the Great Crusade was sworn to eradicate. The Imperials operated on the axiom that knowledge of the warp's true nature was a cognitive hazard. If a man knew demons existed, he might be tempted to worship them. Therefore, the Imperium burned the books, silenced the witnesses, and claimed the monsters were just aliens. The Interex argued that this enforced ignorance was a fatal flaw. They contended that you cannot fight a pathogen you refuse to acknowledge. By hiding the nature of cows, the Imperium was merely leaving its population uninoculated against the inevitable infection. The Hall of Devices stood as the physical manifestation of this doctrine. To the Space Marines walking its polished floors, the museum felt less like a gallery and more like a containment facility for radioactive isotopes. The air was scrubbed and chilled, the lighting harsh and revealing. There were no shadows for things to hide in. The exhibits were sealed behind stasis fields of immense power, suspending the objects in a timeless freeze. These were not trophies of glory. They were samples of a disease. The artifacts displayed within were weapons and tools recovered from civilizations that had fallen to cows, primarily the Kindbrak during their Dark Age. There were blades forged from metals that seemed to drink the light, armor that writhed with subsonic tremors even in stasis, and musical instruments designed to drive listeners into a homicidal frenzy. The Interex guides, speaking through the translation servitors, explained the provenance of each item with the detached tone of a pathologist discussing a tumor. They pointed out the mark of cows on the hilts of swords, subtle, shifting geometries that hurt the human eye to track. For the Astartes, specifically Captain Garville Loken and the members of the Mournival, this tour was an exercise in discipline. Their gene-enhanced physiology reacted to the proximity of the corruption. Their hearts beat faster, their combat stims flooded their systems, and a low-level nausea settled in their guts. This was the transhuman dread reversed, the biological rejection of the unnatural. Yet, the Interex citizens walked among these horrors calmly. They looked at a blade capable of stealing a soul and saw only a historical error, a mistake made by a species that had failed to control its passions. The Interex philosophy on these artifacts was strictly preservationist. They believed that to destroy the artifacts was to destroy the evidence of the threat. If they melted down the cursed blades, future generations might forget what a cursed blade looked like. They might forget the specific signature of Cow's craftsmanship. Therefore, the items were kept, cataloged, and studied under the strictest protocols. The Hall of Devices was a library of warning signs. It was intended to show the people of the Interex exactly what happened when vigilance failed. This policy of contain and study was anathema to the Imperial Creed, the standard operating procedure for the Great Crusade upon finding such witch weapons was immediate annihilation. Plasma fires were used to slag the metal, and the ashes were ejected into the heart of a star. To the Imperium, the object itself was evil. To the Interex, the object was neutral. It was the intent and the origin that were dangerous. They believed their science and their mental fortitude were strong enough to keep the corruption behind the glass. They had weaponized their own rationality, convinced that as long as they treated cows as a scientific phenomenon, they remained immune to its seduction. The tension in the hall was palpable when the delegation reached the section dedicated to the Kindbrak's most potent creations. Here lay the anathemes. These were simple-looking weapons, often resembling flint knives or primitive daggers, lacking the technological sophistication of a power sword or a chain axe. Yet the energy they radiated was profound. The Interex explained that these weapons were semi-sentient, capable of tuning themselves to a specific target, ensuring that a wound inflicted would be fatal, defying all biological or medical intervention. They were tools of murder, forged with the specific intent of ending a life that could not otherwise be ended. Horus Lupercal, standing before the display, was visibly intrigued. The War Master possessed a mind that was constantly evaluating assets. He saw the danger, yes, but he also saw the utility, a weapon that could kill anything. In a galaxy filled with horrors like the Megarachnids or the Atrud, such a tool had value. However, his fascination was tempered by the caution instilled in him by his father. He questioned the Interex leadership on the wisdom of keeping such things intact. The Interex response was a lecture on maturity. They claimed that a society that felt the need to destroy knowledge was a society that feared itself. They kept the anathemes to remind the Kindbrak of their past sins and to remind themselves that even the simplest tool could be corrupted by cows. This intellectual arrogance was the Interex's blind spot. They assumed that because they had no desire to use the anathemes, no one else would either. They projected their own rationality onto the galaxy. They believed that the Imperium, being human, must share their fundamental aversion to cows. They did not understand that the Imperium was a collection of warrior tribes held together by a god myth, and that within the Imperium's ranks were individuals who did not view the warp as a hazard, but as a resource. The presence of First Chaplain Erebus of the Word-Bearers within the Imperial fleet went largely unnoticed by the Interex, yet he was the precise variable their equations failed to account for. To a man like Erebus, the Hall of Devices was not a museum, it was a candy store. The Interex's clinical approach to cows, their refusal to mystify it, actually made them vulnerable to a true practitioner of the dark arts. They had stripped the spiritual defenses away, relying on logic to contain entities that defied logic. They had built a cage for a tiger using mathematical formulas instead of iron bars, believing the tiger would respect the math. The discussions regarding cows also highlighted a linguistic and conceptual barrier that the iterators and diplomats struggled to bridge. When the Interex asked if the Imperium was cows tainted, they were asking if the imperial citizenry practiced emotional regulation and avoided warp sorcery. The Imperials, hearing this, were insulted. They interpreted the question as an accusation of mutation or witchcraft. The Imperium's definition of taint was physical, tentacles, extra eyes, madness. The Interex's definition was metaphysical. A man could be physically perfect, like the Astartes, but if his soul was consumed by the desire for war and bloodshed, to the Interex, he was already touching the edge of cows. This was the crux of the misunderstanding. The Interex looked at the Astartes, genetically engineered killers, psycho-indoctrinated to know no fear, obsessed with martial glory, and saw vectors for corruption. They saw beings that were unbalanced, creatures of pure aggression. To the Interex, the Space Marines were perilously close to the Kindbrak warriors of old, teetering on the brink of becoming berserkers for the dark powers. This was why they kept their shields up. This was why they insisted on the term cows rather than warp. They were trying to warn their lost cousins that their very method of existence, their Great Crusade, was feeding the enemy they claimed to not believe in. The imperial truth, with its rigid denial of the divine, offered no counter-argument to this. The imperial negotiators could only reiterate that demons were xenos and that the emperor protected them. They could not engage with the Interex on the level of metaphysics because they were forbidden from having a metaphysics. They were trying to discuss the nature of fire with a people who understood thermodynamics, while they themselves were only allowed to believe that heat was a myth. Within the Hall of Devices, the security protocols were rigorous but, crucially, automated. The Interex trusted their machines. The stasis fields were controlled by the aria, modulated by the harmonic frequencies of the building. There were no armed guards standing directly over the cases because the Interex believed the social contract was sufficient. Who would break into a museum to steal a disease? The idea was absurd to them. This reliance on the honor system, backed by technology, stood in stark contrast to the imperial way, which would have placed a squad of custodes or stormtroopers around such dangerous items. The atmosphere in the museum shifted from curiosity to a simmering hostility as the tour progressed. Abaddon and the more hawkish commanders of the 16th Legion viewed the preservation of these artifacts as a sign of weakness. To them, mercy to an inanimate object of evil was as offensive as mercy to a xenos. They saw the Interex as hoarders of filth, playing with fire in a paper house. The mere fact that the anathems existed, sitting there on velvet cushions behind glass, was an insult to every drop of blood shed to cleanse the galaxy of such horrors. Conversely, the Interex guides began to perceive the imperial agitation not as righteous zeal, but as a lack of self-control. They saw the Astartes' hands twitching near their bolters. They sensed the spike in aggression pheromones. To the Interex, this confirmed their fears. The Imperium was a blunt instrument, a child with a hammer, incapable of understanding the nuance of the universe. They began to realize that their warning was falling on deaf ears. The Imperium did not want to learn about cows, it wanted to shoot it. And if it couldn't shoot it, it wanted to pretend it wasn't there. The tragedy of the situation was that both sides were partially correct. The Interex were right that knowledge and vigilance were better defenses than ignorance. But the Imperium was right that some things are too dangerous to exist, regardless of the safeguards. The Interex had underestimated the malignancy of the warp, treating it like a natural disaster rather than a sentient malevolence that could whisper through glass and corrupt the codes of a machine. They had underestimated the capacity for treachery within the human heart, failing to realize that not all humans wanted to avoid cows. Some sought to embrace it. As the delegation prepared to leave the Hall of Devices, the anatheme remained in its case, a sliver of darkness caught in the light. It was a dormant catastrophe, waiting for a hand that was willing to use it. The Interex believed they had jailed the weapon. The Imperium believed the weapon should not exist. But in the shadows of the diplomatic entourage, eyes were watching that believed the weapon had a destiny. The Interex's sophisticated, enlightened approach to the warp, their cows, had created the perfect environment for the very thing they feared to take root. They had preserved the means of their own destruction, polishing it and putting it on display, assuming that reason was a shield. The cultural exchange that was meant to foster unity was instead highlighting the incompatibility of the two civilizations. The Interex's chaos was a scientific reality to be managed. The Imperium's warp was a dark secret to be denied. One society walked with its eyes open, perhaps too wide, staring into the abyss until they felt comfortable with it. The other walked with its eyes shut tight, swinging a sword in the dark. In the quiet, sterile air of the Hall of Devices, the silence was not one of peace, but of a held breath before the plunge. The knowledge of cows, rather than bridging the gap, was widening it, turning a potential alliance into a collision of philosophies that would leave only one standing. The anatheme waited, the silent protagonist of the coming tragedy, a testament to the fatal danger of tolerance in a galaxy that demanded absolute conviction. The silence that initially greeted the 140th Expeditionary Fleet upon entering the Eurosarach system was not the quiet of the void, but the held breath of a predator waiting for the trap to spring. Captain Kita's Frome of the Blood Angels, commanding the 9th Legion forces attached to the expedition, viewed the planet below not as a mystery to be unraveled, but as a compliance target to be broken. The world was a churning ball of atmospheric violence, its surface obscured by red clouds and electromagnetic storms that played havoc with the fleet's auspex arrays. Standard Imperial doctrine called for prolonged orbital bombardment to soften such a target, but the atmospheric density and the erratic magnetic fields made precise targeting impossible. To secure the world, boots had to be put on the ground. Frome's assault was aggressive, characteristic of the 9th Legion's doctrine of shock and awe, yet it was doomed by the very geography of the world they sought to conquer. As the drop pods of the Blood Angels screamed through the upper atmosphere, they were buffeted by gale-force winds that scattered their landing coordinates. The surface of Eurosarach was not the open plains or hive cities the Astartes were accustomed to. It was a forest of stone. Immense, petrified spires, resembling the trunks of dead trees, rose kilometers into the sky, creating a claustrophobic vertical labyrinth. The drop pods smashed into these spires or were funneled into the deep, shadowy canyons between them, isolating squads from one another before the first bolter could be racked. The massacre that followed was a testament to the lethal efficiency of the planet's inhabitants. The megarachnids were unlike any xenos species the Blood Angels had previously encountered. They were not a civilization in the traditional sense, but a biological weapon stripped of all restraint. Towering over a space marine, these arachnid forms possessed chitinous armor that deflected standard bolter rounds and limbs that ended in monomolecular blades capable of shearing through ceramite plate, flesh, and bone in a single fluid motion. They moved with a terrifying, skittering speed, utilizing the verticality of the stone trees to launch ambushes from above, negating the Astartes' advantage in disciplined firing lines. The tactical readouts from the 140th expedition painted a picture of rapid, confusing slaughter. The Blood Angels, separated and unable to establish a cohesive defensive perimeter, were hunted down piecemeal. Their jump packs, usually their greatest asset, proved to be a liability in the dense tangle of stone spires. Astartes who attempted to take to the air were snatched by the megarachnids or dashed against the rocks by the unpredictable winds. The Vox channels were filled not with tactical coordination, but with the wet sounds of butchery and the dying roars of the Emperor's sons. Within hours, the initial drop force was annihilated. The red dust of Eurosarach drank the blood of the 9th Legion, and the planet fell silent once more, save for the howling of the wind and the chittering of the victors. When the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet arrived in the system, responding to the faint, ghostly distress signals of the 140th, they found a graveyard. The rescue operation, initially spearheaded by the Emperor's children under Lord Commander Eidolon and Captain Saul Tarvitz, had barely managed to secure a foothold. They had recovered the bodies of the Blood Angels, desecrated, stripped of their gene seed, and hung from the stone trees like grisly trophies, but they too had become pinned down by the relentless waves of xenos. It required the arrival of War Master Horus and the Luna Wolves to break the stalemate. The deployment of the 16th Legion was a masterclass in combined arms warfare, a brutal corrective to the Blood Angels' failed assault. Horus did not simply drop troops, he dropped a hammer. The Justaran Terminators teleported into the thickest fighting, their cataphracti armor impervious to the glancing blows of the megarachnid blades, their combined bolters churning the xenos into green ichor. Heavy support squads equipped with flamers and autocannons burned back the foliage of the stone forest, creating kill zones where the superior range of the Astartes could be brought to bear. The Warmaster himself took to the field, a golden giant wading through the swarm, world-breaker crushing chitin and stone alike. The megarachnids, for all their biological lethality, were being pushed back by the sheer industrial violence of the Crusade's finest legion. It was at the height of this counter-offensive, as the skies above the drop zones filled with the contrails of Thunderhawks and the orbital bombardment finally began to find its rhythm, that the tactical situation shifted irrevocably. The sensors of the Vengeful Spirit detected a new contact translating from the system's edge. This was not a reinforcement fleet from Terra or a wandering rogue trader. These ships were sleek, disc-shaped, and moved with a silent, gravitic grace that defied the brute force propulsion methods of the Imperium. They broadcast no identifying codes recognized by the Administratum, but instead filled the void with a complex mathematical signal, a warning. The Interex had arrived. The confrontation in orbit was tense, a standoff between the Gothic, gun-studded hulks of the Imperial Navy and the elegant, silvered discs of the Interex. The newcomers did not open fire, but their targeting arrays locked onto the Imperial vessels with alarming speed. Their message, translated by the fleet's linguists and logic engines, was not a declaration of war, but a reprimand. They demanded to know why the Imperials were trespassing on a reservation. To the commanders of the 63rd Expedition, this concept was baffling. They saw a death world infested with hostile xenos. The Interex saw a prison that had been breached. The Interex claimed sovereignty over the system, which they called Uriserach, and ordered the immediate cessation of hostilities. They revealed that the stone spires were not natural formations, but artificial atmospheric regulators, whether control towers designed to generate the perpetual storms that kept the megarachnids grounded. By attacking the planet and bombing the surface, the Imperium was not conquering a world. They were damaging the bars of a cage. The megarachnids, the Interex explained, were the degenerate remnants of a once spacefaring empire that had threatened the Interex domain. Having defeated them, the Interex had stripped them of their technology and confined them to this single world, maintaining the weather towers to ensure they could never leave. This revelation necessitated a face-to-face meeting. A delegation from the Interex descended to the surface, landing in a zone secured by the Luna Wolves. The environment was still hostile, the wind howling through the stone canyons, carrying the stench of ozone and dead xenos. The meeting took place amidst the carnage of the recent battle, the ground littered with the dismembered carapaces of megarachnids and the spent brass casings of bolter rounds. Representing the Warmaster were the members of the Mournival, Garvil Loken, Tarek Torgeddon, Horus Aximand, and Ezekiel Abaddon. They stood in their battle-scarred plate, weapons mag locked but ready, radiating the transhuman menace that was their birthright. Opposite them stood the Interex delegation, led by a commander named Mithras Tull. The visual contrast between the two groups was stark. The Astartes were walking tanks, industrial and heavy, designed for the rigors of total war. Tull and his soldiers, the Sagitars, were sleek and refined. Tull wore armor that was a marvel of articulation, plates of white composite material that interlocked seamlessly, offering protection without the bulk of ceramite. He held a helmet under his arm, revealing a face that was human, noble, and etched with a look of severe disapproval. His guard was composed of warriors in the centaur configuration, their lower bodies locked into mechanical walkers that gave them a stable, four-legged stance, their energy weapons humming with a low, potent frequency. The interaction was fraught with cultural friction from the outset. Mithras Tull spoke High Gothic with an archaic, formal lilt. His words translated through the musical cadence of the aria devices his troops wore. He looked upon the Astartes not with fear, but with a mixture of pity and disdain. He questioned the logic of the Imperial assault, asking why they had ignored the warning beacons placed at the system's periphery. To Tull, the Imperium's actions were akin to a child wandering into a tiger pit and then blaming the tiger for biting. Loken and Torgeddon, the more temperate voices of the Mournival, attempted to explain the Imperial position. They spoke of the distress calls from the Blood Angels, framing the assault as a rescue mission for their kin. They explained that the Imperium had no knowledge of the Interex's claim or the nature of the planet. They were explorers reuniting humanity, and they had reacted to a hostile xenos threat as their doctrine dictated. Tull listened, but his responses highlighted the vast ideological gulf between the two civilizations. He revealed that the Interex had detected the Blood Angels' arrival and had watched them die. When Abaddon, bristling with aggression, demanded to know why the Interex had not intervened to save fellow humans, Tull's answer was chilling in its pragmatic logic. He explained that the Blood Angels had violated the quarantine. To intervene would have been to risk the integrity of the reservation. The megarachnids were dangerous, yes, but they were contained. The Blood Angels were an external variable that had disrupted the ecosystem of the prison. In the eyes of the Interex, the 140th expedition had been victims of their own negligence and aggression. This statement nearly caused violence. For Abaddon and Aximand, the idea that human lives, Astartes' lives, were less important than the integrity of a xenos prison was an insult that warranted immediate retribution. It was the antithesis of the Great Crusade's humanity first doctrine. Loken, however, pressed for understanding. He asked about the megarachnids, trying to bridge the gap by focusing on the common enemy. It was here that the thematic clash became most acute. Tull explained the Interex policy regarding the megarachnids. They did not practice extermination. They believed that wiping out a sentient species, even one as dangerous as the megarachnids, was a moral failing. They had defeated the arachnids in war, dismantled their empire, and removed their ability to threaten others. That, to the Interex, was victory. To kill them all would be waste, it would be genocide. They maintained Eurosarach as a reservation, a place where the species could exist in a primitive state, serving as a living reminder of the conflict and a testament to the Interex's mercy. To the Imperial commanders, this was madness. The Imperium's policy on xenos was absolute: suffer not the alien to live. The existence of the megarachnids was a threat that could not be tolerated. The idea of spending resources to maintain a prison world for a species that wanted to eat you was seen as a dangerous indulgence, a sign of a society that had grown soft and forgotten the harsh realities of the universe. Torgadon pointed out the piles of dead megarachnids around them, the result of the Luna Wolves' work, and asked if this was not a cleaner solution. Tull looked at the carnage with distaste, calling it butchery and inelegant. The conversation revealed that the Interex viewed the Imperium's crusade not as a glorious reconquest, but as a rampage. They saw the Astartes as gene-enhanced biological weapons that had been let off the leash, lacking the philosophical maturity to wield the power they possessed. Tull used the term cows during the exchange, asking if the Imperium's aggression was a symptom of corruption, a question that confused the Mournival, who knew nothing of the warp's true nature. The tension on the windswept plateau of Eurosarach was a microcosm of the tragedy that was unfolding. The Imperium brought fire and certainty, a binary view of the galaxy where everything was either human and compliant or alien and dead. The Interex brought nuance and containment, a complex worldview where threats were managed rather than obliterated. The Blood Angels had died because they could not conceive of a world that was a prison. They only saw a battlefield. The Interex had let them die because they could not conceive of a human faction so reckless as to ignore the warning signs. As the meeting concluded and the Interex delegation withdrew to their shuttle, the storm clouds above Eurosarach began to thin, the weather control towers adjusting to the new equilibrium. But on the ground, the storm was just beginning. The discovery of the Interex had posed a question the Great Crusade was ill-equipped to answer. What happens when the lost kin you seek to save turns out to be morally superior to the savior? The incident on Murder was not just a military blunder. It was the first crack in the mirror, the moment the Imperium looked at the Interex and saw a reflection that made its own face look scarred and brutish. The rescue of the survivors was completed, the bodies of the fallen Blood Angels recovered, but the victory was hollow. The 63rd expedition had found something far more dangerous than the megarachnids. They had found an alternative to the Emperor's truth. The translation of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet from the turbulent, storm-racked orbit of Eurosarach to the serenity of the Zenobia system marked a profound shift in the sensory experience of the Crusade forces. where the previous weeks had been defined by the claustrophobic red dust and the screeching winds of the megarachnid prison world, Zenobia Principes presented itself as a jewel of civilization that seemed to defy the grim aesthetic of the Imperium. The capital world of the Interex sat in the void like a testament to a different path of human evolution, one where the struggle for survival had not necessitated the abandonment of beauty or the total militarization of society. As the vengeful spirit and its escort vessels established a high anchor orbit, the viewports revealed a planet of vibrant blues and greens, its night side illuminated not by the harsh sodium glare of industrial hives, but by the soft, pearlescent glow of cities designed in harmony with their environment. The diplomatic summit was arranged to take place in the heart of the capital city, a sprawling metropolis that lacked the defensive walls and void shield generators that were standard features of even the most secure imperial worlds. To the strategic eyes of the lunar wolves, this openness was initially read as naivety, a fatal tactical error for a civilization that knew the galaxy was full of predators. However, as the Stormbirds descended through the atmosphere, ferrying Warmaster Horus and his chosen retinue to the surface, the perspective shifted. The absence of fortifications was not a sign of weakness, but of supreme confidence. The Interex did not hide behind walls because they believed their control of the surrounding space was absolute. The city below was a garden of architectural marvels, where fluted towers of white stone and glass rose from manicured parklands, connected by suspended walkways and gravity-defying transit loops. The air was clean, carrying the scent of vegetation rather than the recycled ozone of void ships or the chemical smog of manufactorums. Warmaster Horus Lupercal descended to the landing platform with the full majesty of his rank, flanked by the Mournival and a select guard of Justarin Terminators. He had laid aside the most aggressive trappings of war, though he still wore the serpent scales, his golden armor gleaming in the sunlight of Zenobia. His intent was to project power tempered by wisdom, to appear not as a conqueror come to ravage, but as a long-lost brother returning with the strength to protect. The reception party awaiting him was led by the Dioscuri, the enigmatic leaders of the Interex, whose exact political function remained somewhat opaque to the imperial iterators. They were not kings in the feudal sense understood by the Imperium, but rather spokespeople for the collective will of the Interex meritocracy, their voices harmonized with the omnipresent aria that permeated the city's airwaves. The initial proceedings took place in a grand amphitheater open to the sky, a setting that encouraged transparency and discourse. Here, the Warmaster engaged the Interex leadership in a series of high-level debates that sought to bridge the chasm between two divergent branches of humanity. Horus spoke with the charisma that had made him the Emperor's favorite son, articulating the vision of the Great Crusade. He spoke of the unity, of the necessity of bringing all human worlds under the aegis of Terra to ensure mutual protection against the xenos threats that prowled the void. He framed the Imperium's expansion as a moral imperative, a rescue mission to save isolated pockets of mankind from the darkness of old night. The Dioscuri listened with a polite, almost clinical detachment. Their responses were measured, filtered through the melodic language of their culture before being translated into High Gothic. They challenged the Warmaster's assertions with a logic that was disarming in its directness. They questioned the necessity of the imperial truth's rigid secularism and the brutality of its compliance methods. To the Interex, the Great Crusade appeared less like a reunification and more like an assimilation, a forced homogenization that stripped unique cultures of their identity in favor of a monolithic imperial standard. They pointed to the destruction on Eurusarach as evidence of the Imperium's lack of subtlety, arguing that a civilization that resorted to extermination as a first response was one that had failed to mature socially. Horus countered these arguments with the pragmatism of a soldier who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer. He argued that the galaxy was not a place for idealism, but a theater of war where only the strongest survived. He posited that the Interex's isolation had afforded them the luxury of peace, a luxury paid for by their obscurity, and that eventually a threat would arrive that their subtle technologies could not contain. He offered them the protection of the legions Astartes, the might of the 16th Legion, and the resources of 1,000,000 worlds. It was a seductive offer, delivered by a demigod of war who genuinely believed that the Interex represented the best possible outcome for a compliance, a society that could join the Imperium as peers rather than subjects. While the War Master and the Dioscuri engaged in these macro-political maneuvers, a more intimate and revealing exchange was taking place between the warrior castes of the two civilizations. Captain Garville Loken, a member of the Mournival and a warrior of deep introspection, found himself drawn to Mithras Tull, the commander of the Interex forces who had first confronted them on murder. The relationship between the two soldiers began with the wary respect of professionals who had seen each other's lethality, but it quickly deepened into a genuine curiosity. Tull was a Sagittar, a warrior who embodied the Interex philosophy of martial excellence combined with personal responsibility. Unlike the Astartes, who were biologically re-engineered from childhood to be weapons, Tull was a baseline human whose combat prowess was the result of intense training, technological augmentation, and the seamless integration of his Centaur battlesuit. During a break in the diplomatic proceedings, Loken and Tull retired to a training gymnasium within the complex. The facility was a stark contrast to the brutal, blood-stained fighting cages of the Vengeful Spirit. It was a space of light and geometry, designed for the perfection of form rather than the endurance of pain. Here, the two warriors engaged in a series of sparring matches and demonstrations that served as a physical dialogue, bypassing the linguistic barriers that plagued the diplomats. Loken, stripped of his power armor and wearing simple training fatigues, displayed the raw, gene-bulked power and transhuman speed of a space marine. He moved with a density and force that was terrifying to behold, a living engine of destruction. Mithras Tull, conversely, demonstrated the elegance of Interex combat doctrine. Even without his heavy Centaur rig, he moved with a fluid grace, utilizing kinetic redirection and precision strikes that targeted nerve clusters and balance points. When they sparred with practiced blades, Loken found that while he possessed the superior strength, Tull's technique was flawless, a product of a culture that viewed war as an art form to be mastered rather than a function of biology. They found common ground in their shared code of honor. Loken recognized in Tull the same desire to protect his people that drove the Astartes, while Tull saw in Loken a discipline that belied the Interex's initial assessment of the Imperials as barbaric berserkers. It was during these exchanges that the similarities between the Astartes and the Interex Guard became most poignant. Both were elites, separated from the populace they served by the nature of their duty. Both lived by a code of brotherhood and sacrifice. Loken found himself admiring the Interex society through the lens of Tull's character. He saw a version of humanity that had retained its nobility without sacrificing its lethality. For a moment, the indoctrination of the Crusade, that the Astartes were the pinnacle of human creation, wavered in the face of a baseline human who could stand toe-to-toe with him in skill and intellect. They spoke of their respective histories, of the wars they had fought, and Loken was struck by the fact that the Interex soldiers were not simply following orders, but were educated, philosophical men who understood the why of their actions, not just the how. However, beneath the veneer of mutual respect and diplomatic banquets, a current of deep suspicion ran through the Interex leadership, a suspicion that centered on the concept of cows. This was the friction point that threatened to unravel Horus's efforts at peace. The Interex were a society that had survived by recognizing and managing the dangers of the warp. They did not view it as a mystical realm of gods, but as a perilous dimensional hazard that reacted to strong emotion and intent. To them, cows was a contagion, a corruption that could take root in the minds of the unguarded and twist them into monsters. They had built their entire civilization, from their musical language to their lack of warp drives, around the principle of denying cows a foothold. The Interex looked upon the Imperium and saw a civilization that was recklessly flirting with disaster. They saw the Astartes, beings engineered for violence, flooded with combat hormones, and indoctrinated with a supremacy complex, and saw ideal vessels for cows' corruption. They observed the imperial reliance on the warp for travel and communication, the use of navigators and astropaths, and viewed it as a child playing with a loaded weapon. The aggressive, martial nature of the Crusade, the willingness to exterminate entire species, and the blind obedience to a distant emperor all bore the hallmarks of a society that was already tainted, or at least dangerously susceptible. This suspicion was voiced in the closed sessions of the summit. The Dioscuri probed Horus and his advisors about their knowledge of the great enemy. The imperial response was one of confusion and denial. The imperial truth stated that there were no gods, no demons, only xenos and scientific phenomena. When the Interex spoke of cows, the Imperials heard superstition. When the Imperials spoke of the secular truth, the Interex heard the hubris of the infected. The Interex leadership began to fear that the Imperium was not a savior, but a carrier of the plague they had spent millennia fighting. They worried that the Warmaster's crusade was unknowingly doing the work of cows by spreading violence and turmoil across the galaxy, feeding the very powers the Interex sought to starve. The tension was exacerbated by the presence of the Kindbrak within Interex society. The Imperial delegation, particularly the more hardline elements like First Captain Abaddon, viewed the integration of the alien Kindbrak as a heresy. They saw it as weakness. But the Interex explained that the Kindbrak were a conquered people who had once been corrupted by cows. By disarming them and integrating them, the Interex believed they had neutralized the threat. They pointed to the Hall of Devices, the museum where the Kindbrak's cursed weapons, the anathems, were kept in stasis. They used this as an example of their mastery over the corruption. They could study it, contain it, and understand it without being consumed by it. This explanation did little to assuage the Imperial fears. In fact, it deepened the divide. To the Imperium, the mere existence of cows' artifacts was an abomination that demanded cleansing by fire. To keep such things was madness. To the Interex, the imperial desire to destroy knowledge was a sign of fear and ignorance. They argued that you cannot defeat an enemy you refuse to understand. This philosophical deadlock cast a long shadow over the negotiations. While Horus charmed the crowds and Loken bonded with Tull, the Interex security forces remained on high alert, their sensors scanning the Imperial ships and soldiers for the telltale energy signatures of the warp, convinced that a force so powerful and so aggressive could not possibly be clean. The atmosphere on Zenobia Principes thus hung in a delicate balance. On the surface, there was the promise of a golden alliance, a reunification of two great strands of humanity that could reshape the galaxy. The scribes and remembrancers of the 63rd expedition were already composing the epics of this historic meeting, envisioning a future where Interex technology and Astartes might combine to usher in a new age. But beneath the surface, the ideological tectonic plates were grinding against each other. The Interex's enlightened caution clashed with the Imperium's brute force manifest destiny. The accusation of cow's taint remained an unspoken but palpable barrier, a question that the Imperium could not answer because it did not understand the question, and which the Interex feared was already answered by the blood on the Astartes' hands. As the summit stretched into days, the debates became circular. Horus remained patient, convinced he could win them over through force of personality and the undeniable logic of unity. He allowed the Interex to conduct their scans, to question his men, believing he had nothing to hide. He did not know that within his own fleet, hidden in the shadows of the word-bearer's contingent, were those who not only knew of cows but served it. The Interex's vigilance was directed at the Warmaster, searching for the monster in the light, while the true danger lurked in the darkness they had not thought to check. The tragedy of Zenobia was being written in these moments of misunderstanding, where the Interex's correct diagnosis of the danger was applied to the wrong patient, and the Imperium's blind spot to the warp left them vulnerable to the very corruption the Interex was trying to warn them against. The Hall of Devices stood as the architectural and philosophical centerpiece of the Interex capital on Zenobia, a structure that defied the brutalist, fortress monastery aesthetic favored by the Imperium of Man. While the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet was accustomed to armories buried beneath kilometers of rockcrete or void-shielded bastions designed to withstand orbital bombardment, the hall was a celebration of transparency and confidence. It was a vast, sprawling complex of glass, plasteel, and white stone, situated in the center of a manicured parkland, open to the public and bathed in natural light. To the casual observer, it resembled a university or a temple of the arts rather than a containment facility for some of the most dangerous artifacts in the known galaxy. This design choice was deliberate. The Interex believed that hiding the tools of war and the relics of corruption only gave them power, whereas exposing them to the scrutiny of science and reason rendered them mundane. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile and hushed, maintained by acoustic dampeners that filtered the ambient noise of the city into a respectful silence, broken only by the low, rhythmic hum of the stasis generators. The exhibits were arranged not by era, but by species and threat level. There were galleries dedicated to the megarachnid wars, displaying the severed, chitinous limbs of the arachnids alongside the energy weapons used to dismantle their empire. There were sections housing the sleek, crystalline technology of the Eldar, which the Interex had encountered and studied with a mix of wariness and admiration. But the heart of the museum, the sector that drew the dark attention of the 17th Legion's representative, was the vault dedicated to the Kindbrak and their dalliance with the warp. The Kindbrak gallery was a somber space, the lighting dimmed to protect the sensitive materials within the display cases. Here lay the physical history of the Interex's greatest struggle, the war to subdue a species that had weaponized the immaterial. The artifacts were unsettling to the human eye. There were suits of armor forged from alloys that seemed to ripple like oil on water, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. There were musical instruments, flutes and drums, carved from bone that, according to the museum placards, could induce madness or homicidal rage if played in specific keys. And there were the blades. The Kindbrak were master metallurgists, and before their integration into the Interex, they had learned to fold the energy of the warp into the steel of their swords. These weapons sat on velvet plinths behind high-grade stasis fields, their edges still keen, radiating a palpable sense of malice that made the hair on the back of a neck stand up. Among these weapons, resting in a case of unassuming simplicity, was the anatheme. To an uneducated eye, it appeared primitive, almost Neolithic. It was a dagger, or perhaps a short sword, chipped from a material that resembled flint or tessellated obsidian. It lacked the power cables, molecular bonding studs, or disruption field generators that characterized the advanced weaponry of the 31st millennium. It looked like a tool a savage might use to skin a beast. Yet the data slates next to the display, written in the flowing script of the Interex and broadcast via the local ARIA node, identified it as a weapon of terrifying sophistication. The anatheme was semi-sentient. It was a murder tool that empathically bonded with its wielder, tuning its molecular structure to become the absolute bane of a specific target. Once named to a victim, the blade would bypass any armor, shield, or biological defense to deliver a fatal, unhealable wound. It was not a weapon for a soldier. It was a weapon for an assassin, a device of pure spite. It was this weapon that first chaplain Erebus of the Word Bearers sought. The chaplain had moved through the diplomatic proceedings like a shark in a koi pond, his transhuman physiology cloaked in the crimson plate of his legion, his demeanor one of pious observation. While War Master Horus Lupercal charmed the Interex leadership and Captain Garville Loken sparred with Mithras Tull, Erebus was calculating. He saw the Interex not as a lost civilization to be saved, but as a repository of tools necessary for the great game the Chaos Gods were playing. The Interex's clinical, scientific approach to cows amused him. They thought they had trapped the warp in glass cages, unaware that the warp was not a specimen to be cataloged, but a living force that could reach out through the barriers. The infiltration of the Hall of Devices was executed with a precision that belied the brute force usually associated with the Astartes. Erebus did not storm the gates. He utilized the distraction of the ongoing festivities and the diplomatic receptions to slip away from the main Imperial contingent. The security of the Interex, for all its technological advancement, was heavily reliant on the ARIA, the sonic network that connected their society. The sensors within the museum were tuned to detect unauthorized biorhythms, rapid movement, and the energy signatures of weapons discharge. They were not tuned to detect the esoteric, non-Euclidean signatures of high sorcery. Erebus was a master of the dark tongue, the language of Enuncia that the Emperor had forbidden. As he moved through the shadowed corridors of the museum, he did not hack the cogitators with code breakers. He whispered to the machine spirits in a language that predated humanity. He utilized rituals of concealment that blurred his presence in the visual and auditory spectrums, appearing to the automated drones and camera feeds as nothing more than a glitch or a passing shadow. The Interex security systems, designed to stop thieves and saboteurs, had no logic gates to process a being who walked partially in the warp. When he reached the Kindbrack vault, the first chaplain deactivated the stasis field surrounding the anatheme not with a keypad, but with a precise application of warpcraft that shorted the containment coherence. The field flickered and died, the air rushing in to fill the vacuum with a sharp hiss. Erebus took the blade. In his gauntleted hand, the anatheme felt heavy and cold, a shard of solidified hate. He could feel the weapon waking up, sensing a kindred spirit in the Astartes who held it. This was the instrument that would bring the Warmaster low, the key to unlocking the heresy that would burn the galaxy. He secured the blade within his armor, Mag locking it to his combat harness beneath his robes. But theft was only half the objective. To cover his tracks and to ignite the powder keg of tension between the Imperium and the Interex, Erebus needed chaos. He needed an event so violent and confusing that the theft would be lost in the immediate need for survival, and the blame would fall squarely on the barbaric Imperials. He planted melta charges and incendiary devices at key structural points within the hall, targeting the power couplings of the stasis generators and the support pillars of the roof. The detonation was catastrophic. The explosion ripped through the Hall of Devices with the force of a thunderclap, shattering the reinforced glass walls and sending plumes of fire and smoke billowing into the pristine sky of Zenobia. The shockwave knocked artworks from their pedestals and shattered the containment fields of hundreds of exhibits. Alarms screamed across the city, the harmonious aria instantly replaced by a discordant, jagged klaxon of war. Inside the museum, the fire suppression systems activated, but the flames, fed by the exotic chemicals of the destroyed exhibits, burned with an unnatural intensity. For the Interex, the destruction of the Hall of Devices was not merely a property crime, it was a spiritual violation and a confirmation of their worst fears. The museum was the symbol of their vigilance, the physical proof of their triumph over cows. To see it burning was to see their protection failing. More importantly, the timing implicating the Imperials was undeniable. The 63rd expedition was the only new variable in the system. The Interex leadership, the Dioscuri, had already been suspicious of the cow's taint within the Imperium. They had seen the Astartes' aggression, their ignorance of the warp, and their martial obsession. Now an explosion in the heart of their most sensitive facility, coinciding with the presence of the Warmaster's fleet, looked less like an accident and more like a preemptive strike or a raid. The security response was immediate and lethal. The Sagittars, the elite soldiers of the Interex, mobilized with terrifying speed. Their Centaur battle suits, previously seen in ceremonial or sparring capacities, locked into combat mode. The automated drones that drifted lazily through the city streets shed their benign programming, their energy fields flaring as weapons ports opened. The aria shifted from a broadcast of news and music to a tactical data stream, coordinating the movement of every Interex unit on the planet. At the diplomatic reception, the mood shifted from celebration to a standoff in a heartbeat. Mithras Tull, who only hours before had been exchanging warrior philosophies with Garville Loken, received the data burst regarding the museum. His face hardened. He looked at the Astartes not as brothers, but as rabid dogs that had finally bitten. The Interex did not ask for an explanation. In their minds, the act explained itself. A cow's tainted force had arrived, and predictably, they had attacked the repository of cow's artifacts. It was the nature of the beast. The Interex forces opened fire. The air of the reception plaza was filled with the silent, deadly hiss of laser bows and the crack of plasma discharge. The Astartes of the Mournival and the Justerin Guard were taken by surprise, their bolters mag-locked, their helmets off. It was a testament to their transhuman reflexes that they were not slaughtered instantly. Garville Loken, reacting to the shift in Tull's posture before the first shot was fired, managed to rally the defense, flipping tables for cover and shouting commands to form a perimeter around the Warmaster. Horus Lupercal was thunderstruck. The Warmaster, usually the master of any battlefield, stood amidst the chaos of the ambush, confused and enraged. He had come in peace. He had genuinely sought to bring the Interex into the fold. He shouted for a ceasefire, his amplified voice booming over the din of combat, but the Interex were not listening. They were fighting a containment action against a viral outbreak. To them, Horus was the carrier, the head of the serpent. The destruction of the hall was the proof that his words of unity were lies designed to lower their guard. The retreat from Zenobia was a running battle of desperate ferocity. The Astartes, the finest warriors humanity had ever produced, found themselves hard-pressed by the Interex. The technological parity was evident. The Interex energy weapons punched through ceramite power armor with ease, and their coordinated drone strikes pinned the Space Marines down, denying them the mobility they craved. The War Master's party had to fight their way back to the landing platforms, carrying their wounded, the dream of a peaceful compliance turning to ash in their mouths. Back at the Hall of Devices, amidst the ruins and the smoke, the true scope of the security failure became apparent to the Interex investigators who braved the flames. They found the empty case where the anatheme had rested. The theft confirmed the narrative the Interex had constructed. The Imperium was not just a brute force empire, it was an agent of chaos seeking to arm itself. They believed the War Master had ordered the distraction to steal the weapon. They could not conceive that the War Master was as much a victim of the deception as they were. The failure of the Interex security apparatus was rooted in their own cultural blind spots. They had built a system to defend against external invasion and internal accident. They had relied on the Aria to monitor the emotional and physical state of the populace, assuming that any act of treachery would be preceded by a detectable spike in aggression or stress. They had not accounted for a sociopath like Erebus, a being whose devotion to the dark gods gave him a cold, focused calm that the sensors read as baseline neutrality. Furthermore, their reliance on technology over physical guards, the belief that a stasis field and an alarm were sufficient deterrents, proved fatal when faced with a foe who could manipulate the laws of physics through sorcery. The Interex assumed that because they were rational, their enemy would be rational. They assumed that if the Imperium wanted the anatheme, they would demand it or fight for it openly. The concept of a shadow war, of a traitor within the ranks working against his own commander, was outside their immediate threat model. They projected their own societal cohesion onto the Imperium. Because the Interex did not have traitors, they assumed the Imperium acted as a single, unified will. Therefore, the act of one Imperial was the act of all. This misunderstanding was the death knell for the Interex civilization. The theft of the anatheme and the destruction of the Hall of Devices shattered the possibility of discourse. The War Master, feeling betrayed and ambushed, felt his own hope harden into a cold resolve. He had offered them his hand, and they had spat on it. He did not know of the theft, he only knew that they had attacked him. In the binary logic of the Great Crusade, a civilization that fired upon a Primarch had forfeited its right to exist. As the vengeful spirit broke orbit and the fleet weapons batteries began to cycle up for a planetary bombardment, the tragedy was complete. The Hall of Devices, built to educate and warn against the darkness, had become the flashpoint that allowed the darkness to win. The anatheme was gone, spirited away into the heart of the 63rd expedition, a ticking time bomb that would eventually find its way to the moon of Davin. The Interex, in their attempt to contain the threat of cows, had provided the very weapon that would ensure its triumph. The peace talks were over. The war for the anatheme and the soul of the War Master had begun, and the first casualty was the truth. The detonation that gutted the Hall of Devices was not merely a structural failure. It was the violent shearing of a cultural artery. The blast wave did not just shatter the reinforced plasteel and crystalline display cases of the museum. It propagated outward through the delicate social lattice of Zenobia Principes, transforming the city from a utopia of high discourse into a mobilized fortress in the span of a single heartbeat. From the vantage point of the diplomatic plaza, where the War Master and his retinue had been engaged in the final stages of negotiation, the plume of smoke rising from the museum district was a stark, black scar against the twilight sky, an oily smudge that smelled of burning history and ancient, forbidden chemicals. The reaction of the Interex populace was instantaneous and terrifying in its synchronicity. There was no panic, no disorganized screaming or stampedes that would characterize a disaster in an imperial hive city. Instead, the citizenry reacted like the cells of a single organism responding to a pathogen. The aria, the omnipresent musical broadcast that served as the nervous system of their society, shifted abruptly. The soothing, complex harmonies that had underscored the diplomatic talks dissolved, replaced by a sharp, discordant rhythm, a war chant composed of mathematical urgencies and aggressive tonal shifts. It was a sound that bypassed the conscious mind and triggered deep-seated conditioning in every man, woman, and drone within the city limits. To the Astartes of the 16th Legion, whose enhanced senses picked up the shift in the sonic landscape instantly, the change was jarring. The ambient noise of the city, previously a low hum of commerce and leisure, became a focused, throbbing pulse. The civilians in the plaza did not flee. They withdrew with practiced efficiency, clearing fire lanes and seeking pre-designated shelter points. The architectural features of the city began to transform. The fluted towers and open-air galleries, which had seemed so defenseless to the Imperial strategic assessors, revealed their hidden teeth. Shutters of ablative armor slid over windows, and the decorative spires retracted to reveal the emitters of heavy energy weapons and shield generators. The most immediate threat, however, came from the Sagittars, the Interex warrior caste, who had stood as ceremonial guards in their gleaming white armor, transitioned to combat readiness with a fluidity that rivaled the post-human reflexes of the Space Marines. The Centaur battlesuits, which had previously allowed them to trot alongside the walking diplomats with regal grace, now locked into their engagement protocols. The mechanical legs widened their stance, servos whining as they primed for rapid traversal, and the energy bows held in their hands hummed as the power cells cycled to lethal output. The drones that hovered above the plaza, previously broadcasting the proceedings to the populace, shed their camouflage of benevolence. Their lenses shifted from recording red to targeting amber, and the air around them shimmered as force fields snapped into existence. For Horus Lupercal, standing at the center of the podium, the sudden violence was a shock that struck deeper than any physical blow. The War Master had spent days navigating the labyrinth of Interex philosophy, suppressing his warrior instincts to present the face of a statesman. He had believed truly and deeply that he was on the verge of a breakthrough, that the integration of this lost branch of humanity was imminent. The explosion and the subsequent mobilization shattered that belief. His initial reaction was not counterattack, but a profound, paralyzed confusion. He looked to the Interex leadership, the Dioscuri, expecting to see shared alarm or a request for aid in fighting a terrorist act. Instead, he saw judgment. The Interex commanders recoiled from the Imperial delegation as if they were standing next to a reactor leak. Their faces, previously masks of polite skepticism, hardened into expressions of absolute revulsion. In the logic of the Interex, there was no mystery to the explosion. They had long suspected the Imperium of being compromised by cows, of being a blunt instrument wielded by dark powers they did not understand. The destruction of the Hall of Devices, the repository of the most dangerous cows' artifacts in their possession, was the final proof. To them, it was a surgical strike designed to recover the weapons of the enemy. The accusation was not delivered in a speech, but in the sudden lethal focus of the Interex military machine. The data bursts traveling through the area carried the verdict. The Imperium was cows tainted. They were not negotiators, they were infiltrators. The theft of the anatheme, the Kindbrak blade capable of unmaking a soul, was the specific crime, though the Imperials in the plaza, save for the hidden traitor Erebus, were entirely ignorant of it. The Interex believed that the War Master had orchestrated the peace talks as a distraction, a dazzling light show to keep their eyes fixed on him while his agents plundered their armory for the tools of damnation. The first shots were fired not by the Astartes, but by the Sagittars. Beams of coherent light, silent and invisible save for the ionization of the air, lashed out across the plaza. They struck the Astartes of the Mournival and the Justarin Guard, testing the limits of Imperial power armor. Unlike the mass reactive explosions of bolter rounds, the Interex weaponry burned. It drilled through ceramite and plasteel with terrifying heat, seeking the flesh beneath. A Justarin Terminator, one of the elite veterans of the First Company, staggered as a heavy laser discharge took him in the shoulder, the white hot beam melting through the layers of his cataphracti plate and fusing the servos of his arm. The response from the Luna Wolves was a roar of disciplined aggression. Bolters were raised, the distinct, thundering bark of the weapons drowning out the electronic war cant of the aria. Mass reactive shells crossed the gap, detonating against the personal energy shields of the Interex soldiers or tearing into the elegant stonework of the plaza. Yet, even as the firefight erupted, Horus Lupercal stood amidst the flying debris and crossing fire, shouting for a ceasefire. His voice, amplified by the vox grill of his armor, boomed over the chaos, demanding order, demanding an explanation. He refused to draw a worldbreaker. He refused to believe that the dream of unity was dead. He stood with his arms spread, a golden target, trying to hold back the tide of war with sheer force of will. It was a tragic tableau. The War Master, the greatest conqueror in human history, was pleading for peace while his own sons killed and died around him. He looked at Mithras Tull, the Interex commander with whom Loken had shared a bond of warrior respect, and saw only betrayal. Horus did not know of the theft. He did not know of Erebus's actions. He only knew that he had come with an open hand, and the Interex had answered with an ambush. In his mind, the Interex were the treacherous ones. They had lured him in, lulled him with talk of culture and philosophy, only to try and assassinate him and his command staff. The confusion in his eyes hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury, the fury of a father whose children were being murdered under a flag of truce. The communication breakdown was total. The Imperial Vox channels were jammed with the tactical chatter of the squads trying to establish a defensive perimeter, while the Interex aria screamed its warnings of Cow's corruption. The Interex could not hear the War Master's denials because their paradigm did not allow for them. To them, a Cow's agent would always lie, would always feign innocence while plunging a knife into your back. The Imperials could not understand the Interex's aggression because they lacked the context of the theft. To them, the Interex had simply gone mad, revealing their true xenophobic colors. Loken, Torgadon, Aximand, and Abaddon formed a protective ring around the War Master, their bolters spitting death at the encroaching Sagittars. Loken, in particular, felt the sting of the betrayal acutely. He had sparred with these men. He had begun to respect them. Now he saw the Centaur suits not as marvels of engineering, but as alien monstrosities. He saw the drones not as helpers, but as soulless killers. He fired a burst that took a Sagittar in the chest, the explosive rounds shattering the white composite armor and spraying blood across the pristine flagstones. The bond of brotherhood he had imagined was an illusion, shattered by the reality of the galaxy's cruelty. The fight in the plaza was a microcosm of the wider conflict now engulfing the city. The Interex security grid, realizing that the infection was present in the Imperial fleet overhead as well, activated the planetary defense batteries. High above, the vengeful spirit registered the targeting locks of ground-based lance arrays. The void shields of the Imperial ships flared as they intercepted the first probing shots from the surface. The fleet, operating on standing orders to protect the Primarch, began to cycle their macro cannons, preparing to rain fire upon the city that had, only moments ago, been a host. On the ground, the situation was becoming untenable. The Sagittars were using their superior mobility to flank the Imperial position, their laser bows cutting apart the cover the Astartes were using. The drones swarmed in from above, their energy fields deflecting bolter fire, while they laid down suppressing beams that forced the Space Marines to keep their heads down. The Justaran were taking casualties, their heavy armor proving less effective against the focused heat of the Interex weaponry than against kinetic rounds. Abaddon, his face twisted in a snarl of vindication, urged the War Master to move. He had never trusted the Interex. He had seen their tolerance of the alien Kindbrak as a sign of weakness and corruption. Now, he viewed this ambush as the inevitable result of trying to reason with those who had strayed from the Emperor's path. He called for the extraction, for the Stormbirds to descend and pull them out of the kill zone so that the fleet could level the city. Horus, finally accepting the reality of the situation, allowed his anger to take the reins. The statesman died in that moment, replaced by the Lord of the 16th Legion. He saw the Interex now not as lost kin, but as a civilization that had rejected the Imperium's mercy. They had attacked a Primarch. They had drawn first blood. The accusation of cows was lost on him, drowned out by the roar of battle. He signaled the retreat, not out of fear, but to regroup and unleash the full measure of his wrath. The extraction was a chaotic, running battle. The Imperial party moved towards the landing platforms, utilizing the heavy firepower of the Terminators to punch a hole through the Interex cordon. The Sagittars pursued, their centaur suits galloping over the obstacles, firing on the move with uncanny precision. Every street corner became a choke point, every open plaza a killing field. The beautiful, pearlescent architecture of Zenobia Principes was defaced by the scars of war, pockmarked by bolter craters and scorched by laser burns. As the Stormbirds roared down from the upper atmosphere, their retro thrusters burning hot and bright, the Interex unleashed their heavy support. Automated turrets rose from the parklands, tracking the descending dropships. The air filled with flak and energy bursts. The Astartes boarded their transports under heavy fire, dragging their wounded and dead with them. The ramp of the War Master's Stormbird closed with a hydraulic hiss, sealing him away from the city that could have been the jewel in his crown. Inside the transport, the silence was heavy, broken only by the panting of the warriors and the dull thud of enemy fire impacting the hull. Horus sat in the command throne, his face a mask of stone. He did not speak. He was processing the magnitude of the failure. He had defied the Council of Terra's edicts to negotiate. He had wasted time and risked his sons for a peace that was a lie. He felt foolish, and for a being of his ego and stature, that was an unforgivable injury. The Interex, watching the Imperial ships ascend, did not cease fire. They believed they were letting a contagion escape, a virus that would now spread unchecked through the stars. They had failed to contain the Kindbrak weapon, and they had failed to kill the carrier. The theft of the anatheme was the catalyst, but the tragedy was systemic. Two civilizations, separated by thousands of years of divergent evolution, had looked at each other and seen only monsters. The Interex saw the Astartes as the unwitting puppets of the warp. The Imperium saw the Interex as arrogant, alien-loving hypocrites who would stab a guest in the back. As the vengeful spirit reached high orbit, the diplomatic channels were dead. The Aria was the only signal coming from the surface, a loop of martial data and warnings broadcast to the other worlds of the Interex coalition. The warning beacons that had once sung of territory and borders now sang of war. The accusation had been made, the judgment rendered. There would be no more talk. The anatheme was in the hands of the 17th Legion, hidden away in the dark, while the 16th Legion prepared to wash away the insult of Zenobia in blood. The Great Crusade, which had paused for a brief, hopeful moment, resumed its grind, fueled now by a personal vendetta that would ensure the Interex civilization was not just defeated, but erased from history. The eruption of violence in the diplomatic plaza of Zenobia Principes was instantaneous, a phase shift from high-minded discourse to total war that occurred within the span of a single heartbeat. The catalyst was the destruction of the Hall of Devices, but the fuel was the sudden, screeching alteration of the Aria. The melodic, mathematical broadcast that permeated the Interex society dissolved into a jagged, discordant war chant, a sonic command that overrode the civilian atmosphere and activated the total mobilization of the populace. For the Astartes of the 16th Legion, the transition was marked by the sudden flare of energy shields and the hum of weapons powering up, sounds that their enhanced hearing picked up milliseconds before the first shots were fired. The tactical situation for the Imperial delegation was immediately catastrophic. They were positioned in the center of an open amphitheater, designed for visibility and acoustic perfection, which now served as a pre-registered kill zone for the Interex security forces. The Sagittars, the elite warrior caste of the Interex, did not hesitate. There was no parley, no demand for surrender. In their eyes, the Imperium had revealed its true nature as an agent of chaos, and the only response to such corruption was immediate sterilization. The first volley of fire from the Interex lines demonstrated the lethal sophistication of their technology. The laser bows wielded by the Sagittars were not the crude las weaponry of the Imperial army, which relied on thermal blooming to cause damage. These were precision-cutting tools, firing coherent beams of such intensity that they punched through the ceramite plating of Astartes' power armor as if it were rotten wood. A standard bolter round explodes on impact. An Interex laser bolt pierces, superheating the air inside the armor and cauterizing the flesh instantly. Several members of the War Master's honor guard fell in the opening seconds, their armor drilled through at the gorgets and eye lenses, smoke curling from the neat, blackened holes. Garville Loken and the members of the Mournival reacted with the post-human speed bred into them by the Emperor's gene rights. They formed a defensive cordon around War Master Horus, their bolters roaring a staccato counter-argument to the silent hiss of the Interex energy weapons. The sheer noise of the Astartes' response was a weapon in itself. The mass reactive shells detonated against the energy shields of the Interex drones and the stone tiers of the amphitheater, throwing up clouds of pulverized rock and dust that obscured the clean lines of the city. The retreat from the plaza was a lesson in asymmetric warfare. The Luna Wolves were masters of the spear tip, the decapitation strike designed to break an enemy line through overwhelming force. Here, however, they were the ones being herded. The Interex fought with a fluidity that baffled the Imperial tactical cogitators. They did not hold ground in static lines. The Sagittars, many mounted in the mechanical Centaur combat rigs, utilized their superior mobility to flank the Astartes constantly. They moved in galloping arcs, firing on the move with stabilized aim, retreating before the heavy bolters of the Luna Wolves could acquire a target lock. The automated drones were the force multipliers. They swarmed the airspace above the plaza, weaving through the columns of smoke. These machines were not merely strafing targets, they were networked to the Sagittars, projecting overlapping fields of defensive energy that deflected bolt shells, and providing real-time targeting data that allowed the Interex soldiers to fire blindly over cover and still score hits. The Astartes found themselves fighting a hive mind, a synchronized enemy that reacted to their movements before they had even completed them. Horus Lupercal, the center of the storm, moved with a cold, terrifying efficiency. The time for diplomacy had turned to ash. He wielded Worldbreaker, his immense power maul, not with the wild abandon of a berserker, but with the precise, crushing force of a tectonic plate. He smashed aside a hovering drone that ventured too close, the machine disintegrating into sparks and twisted metal. His face was set in a mask of grim resolve. He issued commands over the Vox network, coordinating the fighting withdrawal toward the landing platforms where the Stormbirds waited. The Warmaster did not run, he advanced to the rear, his presence anchoring the morale of his sons even as their armor was scored and pitted by the relentless energy fire. As the Imperial column pushed out of the plaza and into the wide, pearlescent boulevards of the city, the engagement fragmented into a series of running skirmishes. The architecture of Zenobia, once admired for its beauty, became a nightmare of firing angles. The fluted towers and suspended walkways provided high ground for Interex snipers, while the open parks offered little cover for the retreating Astartes. It was in this confused, shifting melee that the tragedy of the conflict crystallized into a personal duel between Captain Garville Loken and Commander Mithras Tull. Loken had separated slightly from the main body of the Mournival to secure a flank against a squad of Sagittars attempting to cut off their escape route. He vaulted a low wall of white stone, his bolter churning through a magazine as he suppressed the enemy advance. Through the smoke and the strobe light flashes of laser fire, he saw him. Mithras Tull, the man with whom he had sparred in the gymnasium, the man with whom he had shared a mutual respect as a warrior, stood blocking the path. Tull was clad in his full combat wargear, his lower body locked into a heavy centaur chassis that gleamed like polished bone. In his hands he held a long-bladed energy spear, its tip crackling with a blue-white lethality. The visor of his helmet was down, hiding the human face Loken knew, replacing it with the blank, insected stare of the machine. There was no hesitation in Tull's posture, no recognition of the bond they had formed. To Tull, Loken was no longer a peer, he was a monster, a biological weapon of a corrupted empire that had just desecrated the Interex's holiest site. The duel was a collision of two distinct martial philosophies. Loken fought with the brutal, direct power of the Legion's Astartes. He closed the distance, seeking to negate the reach of Tull's spear, his chainsword revving with a hungry scream. Tull fought with the grace of the Interex, his mechanical centaur limbs allowing him to sidestep and pivot with a speed that defied the laws of inertia. He danced around Loken's strikes, the energy spear darting in to test the Astartes' defenses. It was a fight that should not have happened, a fratricide of the spirit. Loken shouted at Tull, his voice amplified by his helmet's Vox emitters, demanding to know why they had attacked, pleading for reason. Tull did not answer with words. He answered with a thrust that scored a deep furrow across Loken's chest plate, fusing the ceramite and severing the cabling of his auto senses. The silence from the Interex commander was the most damning accusation of all. One does not debate with a plague carrier. The combat was vicious and short. Loken, realizing that words were useless, switched his focus to survival. He baited Tull into an overextension, feigning a stumble as his armor's stabilizers compensated for the damage. As Tull lunged for the kill, the Centaur chassis committing its weight to the strike, Loken pivoted inside the guard. He dropped his bolter and grabbed the shaft of the energy spear with his free hand, the power field burning his gauntlet, and drove his chainsword upward. The adamantium teeth of the chainsword bit into the unprotected joint between the Centaur rig and Tull's torso armor. There was a spray of bright red blood, stark against the white composite, and the mechanical legs buckled. Tull fell, the light in his energy spear dying. Loken stood over him, breathing hard, the adrenaline of combat warring with a profound sense of loss. He looked down at the dying man, at the face now revealed as the helmet seal cracked, and saw only hate in Tull's eyes. There was no reconciliation in death, only the confirmation of the Interex's fears. The Imperium was a force of destruction that killed everything it touched. The death of Mithras Tull signaled the end of the skirmish phase and the beginning of the extraction proper. The 16th Legion, enraged by the ambush and the wounding of their Primarch's honor, escalated their response. The Vox channels crackled with the heavy, grinding tone of teleportation homers activating. The air around the landing platforms distorted, ozone replacing the smell of burning ozone, as the elite of the Legion arrived to secure the War Master's exit. The Justeran Terminators materialized from the warp flare black-armored giants amidst the White City. Led by First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon, they formed an impenetrable wall of cataphracti plate and storm bolters. Abaddon, his face twisted in a snarl of vindication, unleashed the full fury of the First Company. He had never trusted the Interex, viewing their tolerance of xenos as a weakness that masked a deeper rot. Now he felt justified. He ordered the Justeran to advance, not to retreat. The tactical dynamic shifted immediately. The Interex laser weaponry, so effective against standard power armor, struggled to penetrate the dense, layered plasteel and shield generators of the Terminator suits. The Justeran waded into the incoming fire, their combined bolters shredding the Sagitors and their drones. Abaddon fought at the forefront, his lightning claw tearing through the Centaur rigs and the delicate masonry alike. He did not seek to outmaneuver the enemy, he sought to break them. The Justeran cleared the landing zone with ruthless efficiency, turning the pristine parkland into a cratered wasteland of mud and promethium fire. Overhead, the sky began to darken as the Stormbirds and Thunderhawks of the 63rd Expedition descended through the atmosphere. They came down hard and fast, their retro thrusters burning hot, ignoring the anti-aircraft fire that streaked up from the city's defense grid. The pilots of the 16th Legion flew with a reckless disregard for safety, prioritizing the extraction of the War Master above all else. The heavy bolters mounted on the gunships raked the surrounding towers, suppressing the Interex snipers and clearing the final approach vectors. Horus boarded his personal Stormbird, the Mauler, his retreat covered by the wall of black iron that was the Justeran. As the ramp sealed, the War Master's departure triggered the final phase of the engagement. The restraint that had characterized the initial response, the desire to preserve the city and the possibility of peace, evaporated. The order was given to the fleet in high orbit. The vengeful Spirit, the glorious flagship of the Crusade, brought its ventral batteries to bear. This was not the apocalyptic unleashing of cyclonic torpedoes or the planet-cracking power of an exterminatus. The goal was not to destroy Zenobia Principes, but to break the back of its resistance and cover the withdrawal of the Legion assets. It was a surgical application of overwhelming firepower, a lesson in Imperial dominance. Lance strikes, beams of pure energy generated by the massive plasma reactors of the Gloriana-class battleship, stabbed down from the void. They struck with pinpoint accuracy, targeting the Interex defense batteries, the communication hubs, and the pursuing columns of Sagittars. The impact was terrestrial in scale. Entire sectors of the city simply ceased to exist, vaporized in columns of blinding light. The shockwaves flattened the delicate, fluted towers, shattering the glass and toppling the spires into the streets below. The bombardment was a sledgehammer used to kill a wasp. The beautiful, harmonious city, which had stood for thousands of years as a testament to human reason and integration, was defaced in minutes. The pearlescent white stone was scorched black. The gardens were turned to ash. The area, which had shifted to a war cant, was silenced by the electromagnetic interference of the orbital strikes, leaving only the roar of fire and the thunder of collapsing masonry. From the viewports of the ascending gunships, the Astartes looked down upon their handiwork. There was no glory in this destruction, only a cold, bitter necessity. They had come as envoys and were leaving as executioners. The Interex forces, broken by the orbital fire, could no longer pursue. The extraction was successful. The 63rd Expeditionary Fleet pulled away from the gravity well of Zenobia, leaving behind a world that was burning, its potential for alliance turned into a radioactive scar. The Battle of Zenobia Principes was over, but the war it spawned was only just beginning. The violence of the retreat and the death of Mithras Tull served to cement the narrative for both sides. To the Interex, the Imperium had proven itself to be the pawns of cows, treacherous and destructive. To the Imperium, the Interex were a tragic failure, a branch of humanity that had become too alien, too arrogant, and too dangerous to be allowed to survive. The diplomatic failure was absolute, sealed in the blood of the Sagittars and the Astartes who lay dead in the ruins of the capital. The War Master sat in the dark of his transport, the stolen anatheme unknown to him, while the galaxy grew a little darker around him. The orbital bombardment of Zenobia Principes was a calculated act of punitive violence, yet it was truncated by the sudden, shifting priorities of a galaxy spiraling toward civil war. The vengeful spirit and the warships of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet hung in the void above the Interex capital, their lance batteries cycling down from the white-hot intensity of the initial strike. Below, the Garden City that had served as the backdrop for the failed negotiations was a ruin of shattered pearlescent stone and burning vegetation, the harmonious aria silenced by the brute force of Imperial macro cannons. However, the total annihilation of the Interex civilization, a task the 16th Legion was more than capable of executing, was arrested not by mercy, but by a summons that struck at the War Master's personal honor even more deeply than the ambush on the surface. As the Thunderhawks and Stormbirds returned to the hangar decks, carrying the battered remnants of the Mournival and the brooding War Master, the fleet's astropathic choir received a distress signal of high priority. It did not originate from the Interex systems, nor from the distant Council of Terra, but from the Davin system. The message was garbled, thick with the static of warp interference, yet its provenance was undeniable. It came from Yugen Temba, the planetary governor Horus himself had installed decades prior during the initial compliance of Davin. The report detailed a rebellion, not of the populace, but of the governor himself. Temba had renounced his oaths to the Imperium and retreated to the feral moon of Davin, broadcasting challenges that questioned the War Master's fitness to lead. For Horus Lupercal, this betrayal was the final straw in a cascade of indignities. He had just been attacked by a civilization he sought to embrace. Now, a trusted subordinate he had personally elevated had spat on his authority. The strategic calculus of the 63rd Expedition shifted instantly. The Interex, though dangerous and technologically advanced, were a conventional threat. They were contained within their pocket empire, their void travel limited by their reliance on beacon networks. They could be dealt with later, ground down by the slow, inexorable gears of the Imperial Army and the Titan legions. Temba's betrayal, however, was a rot from within, a stain on the 16th Legion's record of compliance that required immediate, personal excision. Consequently, the withdrawal from Interex space was executed with jarring abruptness. The 63rd Fleet did not stay to blockade the system or hunt down the fleeing Interex vessels. They broke orbit, their engines flaring as they aligned for the jump point to the Davin system. This departure left the conflict with the Interex unresolved, a jagged wound in the history of the Great Crusade. The Interex were left battered but alive, their suspicions about the Imperium's cow's taint seemingly confirmed by the erratic, violent behavior of the War Master's forces. They had seen the Imperials arrive with smiles, steal their most dangerous artifact, bomb their city, and then vanish into the warp, a sequence of events that fit perfectly with their understanding of how the servants of the great enemy operated. Unbeknownst to the War Master, the fleet carried with it the seed of his own destruction, a physical object that linked the tragedy of Zenobia to the coming nightmare on Davin. Deep within the bowels of the 17th Legion's vessel, shielded by hexagrammatic wards and the silence of the word-bearers, lay the anatheme. The Kindbrak blade, stolen from the Hall of Devices by First Chaplain Erebus, was no longer a museum piece. It had been liberated from its stasis field and was now active, its semi-sentient structure hungering for the blood it had been forged to spill. The journey of the anatheme from the enlightened, sterile galleries of the Interex to the pestilent swamps of Davin's moon is one of the most significant trajectories in the history of the 31st millennium. It represents the weaponization of history. The Interex had kept the blade as a warning, a pedagogical tool to demonstrate the dangers of the warp. Erebus saw it as a functional key. During the transit to Davin, the weapon was transferred from the word-bearers to the hands of the traitorous governor, Yugen Temba. The exact mechanics of this transfer were cloaked in the confusion of the warp transit and the complex web of secret societies, the warrior lodges, that had infiltrated the legions. When the 63rd expedition arrived at Davin, they found a world that had not merely rebelled, but had succumbed to a grotesque transformation. The influence of Nurgle, the Plague Lord, had taken root on the moon where Temba had crashed his flagship, the Glory of Terra. The swamps were thick with pus and decay, the fauna twisted into undead horrors. It was here, amidst the reeking fog, that the anatheme would fulfill its destiny. Horus led the spearhead assault against his wayward governor, seeking to settle the matter with the edge of Worldbreaker. He waded through the rot, his golden armor shining like a beacon in the gloom, until he confronted Temba on the bridge of the crashed ship. Temba was no longer a man. He was a bloated, rotting vessel of warp energy, wielding the anatheme. The blade had changed to suit its new master and its intended victim. It was no longer the flint-like dagger seen in the museum. It was a shimmering, oily edge of poison light. The duel was brief. Horus, a Primarch in his prime, was vastly superior to the corrupted governor. Yet the anatheme did not require a killing blow to do its work. As Horus crushed Temba, the governor struck out, the Kindbrak blade piercing the War Master's shoulder. It was a minor wound, a scratch to a being of such transhuman physiology, but the anatheme defied biology. Its toxins were not chemical, but conceptual. It severed the War Master's connection to the material realm's healing laws, pouring the raw essence of the warp into his bloodstream. This wound was the direct result of the Interex's failure. They had preserved the weapon, believing their intellect could contain it. They had failed to understand that in a galaxy populated by beings like Erebus, a weapon that exists is a weapon that will be used. The anatheme's poison brought Horus to the brink of death, rendering the apothecaries of the Legion helpless. In their desperation, the Mournival would turn to the Serpent Lodge of Davin for a cure, a ritual that would plunge Horus into a fever dream orchestrated by the Chaos Gods. It was in this dream state that the corruption took hold, turning the Emperor's brightest sun into the arch-traitor. The instrument of this fall was the very artifact the Interex had tried to warn him against. The fall of the Interex civilization itself serves as a grim narrative mirror to the fall of the Imperium, a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions that highlights the central thematic conflict of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, the struggle between knowledge and ignorance in the face of the primordial annihilator. The Interex represented a control group in the great experiment of humanity's survival. They were a society that had encountered chaos, what they called cows, and survived not by hiding from it, but by understanding it. The Interex doctrine was one of vigilance through education. They taught their citizens the nature of the warp. They explained the dangers of unchecked emotion. They integrated alien species like the Kindbrak to dismantle the threat rather than simply killing the host. They proved by their continued existence and prosperity that humanity did not need the imperial truths enforced atheism to survive the predatory nature of the Imperium. In fact, they demonstrated that knowledge was a far more effective shield. Because they knew what cows looked like, they could spot its influence in the Kindbrak and contain it. In stark contrast, the Imperium of man was built on a foundation of necessary lies. The Emperor, in his bid to starve the Chaos Gods of worship, had decreed that the warp was merely a dimension of science, devoid of sentient malice. He had blinded his sons and his subjects to the true nature of the enemy. This ignorance was intended to be armor, but the events surrounding the Interex proved it to be a fatal flaw. When the Interex warned Horus of cows, he did not understand them. He heard superstition where he should have heard a tactical briefing. When he looked at the anatheme, he saw a primitive knife, not a soul killer. The tragedy lies in the fact that the Interex were destroyed by the very thing they had successfully fought, delivered by the hands of their own lost kin. They had defeated the Kindbrak and contained the Megarachnids, only to be crushed by the Imperium. The Imperium, in turn, was destroyed because it refused to listen to the Interex. If Horus had understood the warning, if he had known that the warp was a sentient enemy capable of corrupting his own chaplains, he might have recognized Erebus's treachery. He might have seen the theft of the anatheme for what it was. Instead, the two civilizations collided in the dark. The Interex, for all their wisdom, were undone by their own rigidity. They were so convinced of their diagnostic protocols that they saw the entire Imperium as a monolith of corruption. They lacked the nuance to see that Horus was not yet fallen, only vulnerable. They attacked him, pushing him into the arms of the very conspirators they feared. They drove the 63rd expedition away to Davin, setting the stage for the heresy. The destruction of the Interex is often cited by imperial historians as a necessary compliance of a non-conformist empire, but in the meta-narrative of the setting, it represents the death of hope. The Interex offered a glimpse of a future where humanity could be refined, artistic, and technologically advanced, coexisting with xenos and managing the warp through science and discipline. They were the Star Trek future of the 31st millennium, a rational utopia standing against the gothic horror of the Imperium. Their annihilation validated the grim darkness of the far future. It proved that in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, reason is not a defense. Tolerance is a weakness. The galaxy is not a place for museums and discourse. It is a place for bolters and chainswords. By destroying the Interex, the Imperium destroyed the alternative. They ensured that the only path forward was the one paved with corpses, religious fanaticism, and endless war. The Interex showed that the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable was not the only way humanity could have survived, but by killing the Interex, the Imperium made it the only way left. The legacy of the Interex is silence. Following the withdrawal to Davin and the subsequent outbreak of the Horus heresy, the Interex systems were not immediately razed. However, a civilization that had declared war on a Primarch could not be allowed to endure. In the later years of the Great Crusade and the early turmoil of the heresy, the sons of Horus returned. Driven by the new, dark, aggressive doctrines of their fallen father, they finished what had begun at Zenobia. The details of the final campaign are sparse, lost in the burning archives of the heresy. It is known that the Interex fought with their customary brilliance, their laser bows and drones taking a heavy toll on the traitor legions. But they were a pocket empire standing against a galaxy-spanning war machine fueled by the very powers they had warned against. They were ground into dust. Their beautiful cities were leveled, their hall of devices looted or slagged, and their harmonious aria silenced forever. The Kindbrak were exterminated, their integration proving no protection against the Astartes' hate. Ultimately, the Interex serve as the ghost at the feast of the Great Crusade. They are the haunting what if. What if the Emperor had been more open with his Primarchs? What if the diplomacy on Zenobia had lasted just one more day? What if Loken had managed to convince Tull that they were not enemies? The Interex remain a testament to the tragedy of the setting, that the greatest threat to humanity is often humanity itself, and that the road to hell is paved not just with good intentions, but with the ruins of those who tried to show us a better way. The anatheme, the dagger that killed the dream, would go on to have a long and bloody history, eventually being broken apart, its shards used to create the fulgurite that would play a role in the fate of the Emperor himself. But its most significant cut was the first one, the one that severed the bond between the Interex and the Imperium, condemning the galaxy to 10,000 years of war. In the end, the Interex were right about everything, and for that sin, they died.